Chapter 1342. Inhuman Domain, Magician Association Headquarters, Magic Device District, First Tower. The hall on the first floor of the first tower, which was 795 meters tall and had a total of 200 floors, had become so crowded that not even a drop of water could trickle through. At the very least, when the victims from the chaotic area arrived, they could not even squeeze in. Compensation! Compensation! Is this a natural disaster or a man-made disaster? I don't care. I bought a high amount of magic insurance every year. And it's a family package. Where's the compensation department? Come out and see me. Don't tell me that you need to investigate first. I'll blow up your first tower in minutes. Open the door. Even the tower master of the first tower doesn't dare to come out? Old man, if you don't give me an explanation, I'll climb into your granddaughter's bed tonight and tell her a horror story. Suddenly, a heavenly lightning struck down from the 200th floor of the pagoda. This lightning was as thick as a water bucket. A huge crater was created in front of the lobby of the first floor of the pagoda, and the area was cleared out. We'll thoroughly investigate this matter. Whether you need to compensate and how much you need to compensate, the association will inform you after the final investigation. Now, everyone quiet down and line up to register. If anyone dares to cause trouble here, I'll let the thunderclouds stay in front of your house for 10 days. Also, my granddaughter is only 7 years old. You bastards! They were interested because someone spoke up, but they were also interested because of the shock of this huge bolt of lightning. When the sound from the first tower disappeared, the place suddenly became quiet. Then, the staff of the association began to busily come out and deal with the victims in front of the first tower. However, when these employees saw the densely packed formation, they couldn't help but feel their scalps go numb. It seemed that even more inhumans were beginning to swarm over. How long would it take to deal with this? First tower, 200th floor, main hall of the Secret Arts Tower. In front of the tower master's door, except for Deacon Ace, who was temporarily on a plane in the modern world, the other 3 deacons of the Secret Arts Tower had all arrived. Who can tell me what's going on? The voice that spoke was filled with anger. Moreover, when the deacons looked up, they could see that the tower master was constantly burning with crimson flames. The tower master of the Crimson Blaze Tower was a maniac who had carved more than 10,000 miniature flame spell matrices on his body. It was said that the tower master's goal was to have every cell in his body possess a miniature flame spell matrix at the nano level. He had yet to succeed. A deacon made a gulping sound as he walked out. He lowered his head and said, "It is said that Fafnir suddenly went berserk and charged all the way. Almost no one was spared, Fafnir?" The Scarlet Blaze Tower master immediately frowned, his voice rising and falling like flames. This guy, why did he leave his residence? Wasn't it guarded by someone? Those good-for-nothings from the biology department are just going to watch it go berserk? The deacon was drenched in cold sweat. We don't know yet. Boom! The flames around the tower master of the Crimson Blaze Tower suddenly rose several meters. A huge figure that looked like a fire god suddenly stood up from the tower master's throne. This was the tower master who was easily exposed. Due to the continuous failures in carving matrices on all the cells in his body and the problems with a meditation technique that he practiced as a minor, he was currently in a state similar to a woman going through menopause. Crimson Blaze, sit down. A deep male voice came from a higher throne. It was the first tower master of the Secret Arts Tower, the only person who could calm down the tower master of the Crimson Blaze Tower master when he went berserk. He was the real master of the Magician Association. First tower master, Hui Yao. He was also the first person who proposed to build an autonomous operation system for the inhuman domain, and the most powerful magician who built the 108 bases of the system. As a human, he had lived for 180 years, but he still looked young. Of course, it wasn't difficult for a magician to maintain a youthful appearance. From 1-star to 6-star youth potions, they could meet the needs of different ages. Hui Yao, the Tower Master of the Crimson Blaze Tower Master, frowned, but he still sat down angrily after hearing that. The flames that erupted gradually subsided. It couldn't be helped. When he engraved 100 matrices in his body, he couldn't defeat Hui Yao. When he engraved 500 matrices in his body, he still couldn't defeat Hui Yao. When he engraved 1,000 matrices in his body, he still couldn't defeat Hui Yao. 10,000 matrices. It seemed that the matrices of all the cells in his body were imperative. It's impossible that there's no clue at all. Tell me the specific situation. The first Tower Master spoke again at this time. His voice made the deacons feel relieved. Well, it's like this, First Tower Master. The deacon who reported quickly said at this time, we actually found 2 staff members from the biology department after investigating the scene. We found that Fafner's rampage may be related to them. The Radiance Tower Master nodded. Them? The deacon took out a crystal ball from his arms. Then, the crystal ball began to shine brightly, projecting 2 shadows that were as tall as a person. This is the image of the 2 staff members that we found. After extracting their memories, we synthesized the images of the suspects. Tower Masters, please take a look. When these 2 silhouettes appeared in front of the other Tower Masters, the flame beside the Scarlet Blaze Tower Master suddenly jumped up with a bang sound for some unknown reason. Soon after, it went silent again. The other Tower Masters also had a strange expression. The first Pagoda Master frowned and muttered to himself irresolutely. It's this scourge again. Finally, the Crimson Blaze Tower Master showed a hateful expression. Last time, you almost dug out my golden apple tree and it's not enough. You still want to do it this time? Excuse me. Tower Masters, do you know these 2 women? The young deacon opened his mouth. It was fine if the other Tower Masters were surprised, but even the first Tower Master was surprised at this time. The Radiance Tower Master shook his head. You are still young, so you don't know. If it was the previous deacon, you would have recognized them. The origin of the girl next to them is not clear, but if it's the older one, we are very clear about it. This person. The deacons were all curious. The other female Tower Master said with a complicated tone. He is known as the number 1 scourge of the inhuman domain. Shinryu from the east. Every time this person appears, it will be accompanied by a disaster in the inhuman domain. The last time was in Crimson Blaze's garden. This person almost dug out everything. In addition, he beat him to the point that he had to lie in bed for half a year. Pay attention to your words. I have to repair the array in my body, so I can't move for a short period of time. The Crimson Blaze Tower Master snorted angrily. Well, in short, you can only get out of bed after half a year. I'll let you get out of bed after half a year. You're just bluffing, can you do it? Suddenly, the first Tower Master waved his hand, and the 2 Tower Masters on the throne disappeared. This strange scene scared the deacons so much that they didn't dare to breathe. Radiance, every time this Shinryu from the east comes, nothing good will happen, this time? The Tower Master who sent the thunder had a dignified expression. The first Tower Master muttered, I will personally deal with the matter of the Shinryu from the east. Now, let's first appease those who were hurt by Fafner. Since it was Fafner who destroyed it, as long as it is acceptable, we will compensate. The most important thing now is to find the Berserk Fafner. Where is the Mithril? Why didn't he come? The deacons quickly said. The Mithril Tower Master suddenly said that he had something to do an hour ago. I have already sent a messenger to inform him, but he hasn't replied yet. Is that so? The first Tower Master nodded, then looked at the other Tower Master. Thunder, I'll leave this matter to you. If you encounter someone who takes the opportunity to cause trouble, you can punish them. Understood. The moment the Thunder Tower Master nodded, The aura of the first Tower Master had already disappeared. No one could detect how the Radiance Tower Master left. Magic Engineering District, the private territory of the Scarlet Blaze Tower Master. It was a magical place filled with scarlet things. The little butterfly who was pulled all the way like a kite was still feeling dizzy, but Sister Long didn't know why she wrapped half of her face with a cloth. Of course, she was the same. Sister Long, we seem to be a little sneaky now? The little butterfly monster couldn't help but ask. At this time, the true dragon of the Divine Land said seriously, "You don't know that there is a very mean and stingy old man here. Last time, I just picked an apple to eat. Do you know? He set me on fire for 10 minutes. Have you ever seen such a mean old man? You just picked an apple to eat on the mountain." Although they were wild before they turned into butterflies, they could eat the leaves on the mountain freely, but Luo Dance never went to the flower bed where there were people taking care of it. Sister Long, it's not right to pick an apple to eat without asking him first. Besides, he set you on fire probably because he cares about the apples very much. Don't worry, just pick one. After that, we'll leave this damn place. The Shinryu from Kelowna put his hand on Luo Dance's shoulder, feeling that this butterfly was getting more and more difficult to fool. Why did she read books? But the Shinryu from Kelowna turned his eyes and suddenly had an idea, saying seriously, "I've been researching a medicine recently, which may be able to cure your estrus. This apple is one of the medicinal materials needed, but it doesn't matter if you don't use it. Anyway, I'll still help you the next time you have an attack, but I'm not always by your side. If one day I'm not here and you suddenly have an attack and meet that profiteer, you'll suffer a great loss. Pianxian, I'm doing this for you. Do you know how much I care for you?" "Really?" The butterfly monster blinked her eyes, "but we can ask the owner of this place first." She was afraid that she would be chased away with a broom as soon as she saw him. Long Shirua coughed. "But we don't know when the owner will come back. How about this, after we pick the apples, we'll leave the secret crystals and treat it as a purchase. Is that okay?" Alright then." The little butterfly monster finally nodded and agreed. "Then let's hurry up. There's a troublesome guy here. I can't stay for too long," Long Shirua said, pulling the butterfly's arm, directly going deep into the huge red garden. Luo Dance exclaimed in surprise when they arrived in front of the huge fruit tree with the plundering red apple. Even the leaves were as golden as the texture of the fruit tree. She stood under the crown of the golden branches and leaves, raising her head and opening her arms, slowly rotating her body. "Sister Long, look. It's so beautiful here." But apparently, it was not the first time that Shinryu saw such a wonderful scene in Kelowna, so he was thinking about which one to pick. "Well, it's alive and well, isn't it? It seems that one is too little. It's rare to come here." "Sister Long." "One." Long Shirua immediately covered her ears. "Keep your voice down," the butterfly monster sighed and looked around. Then she picked up a branch from the ground and cleared a small flat ground. She began to write something on the ground with the branch. She wrote some Western characters that Kelowna Shinryu couldn't understand. "What are you writing?" Shinryu glanced at it. When Luo Dance was about to speak, suddenly a low voice came from the crown of the tree. "She's writing that she passed by this precious place and was very happy to see this apple. Unfortunately, the owner of this place is not here, so she left the money to buy the fruit and only took one. Hope the owner of this place won't be angry." Well, what a polite little girl. This wasn't the common language of the Western world, but the official language of Kelowna. Luo Dance was stunned at first, then she looked up and saw an ordinary-looking but good-looking young man on the branch of the tree looking down. The butterfly monster subconsciously asked, "Sir, are you the owner of this place?" Unexpectedly, Kelowna Shinryu looked like he saw a ghost when he saw the young man, his eyes suddenly wandering. The young man smiled at this time, then jumped down and picked a golden apple, throwing it to Luo Dance with a smile. "It's just a golden apple, no need to buy it. It's yours." The butterfly monster held the golden apple in her hand and looked at it curiously. The young man smiled. Do you know the origin of this apple? The butterfly monster shook her head subconsciously. The young man said indifferently, It's said that in the ancient Greek divine system, Goddess Gaia brought back a magical fruit tree from the west coast as a wedding gift for god Zeus and Queen of Heaven Hera. And this magical fruit tree was full of golden apples. Is it this one? The butterfly monster opened her eyes wide. She had read a lot of books, so she knew what Goddess Gaia, God Zeus and Queen of Heaven were. She couldn't help but wonder, but aren't they myths and legends? Why do they appear here? The young man smiled. The legendary golden apple tree appeared here naturally because the essence of this inhuman domain was built by the destroyed Greek divine system's divine kingdom. Am I right, teacher? It was Kelowna Shinryu who looked at him. So, Kelowna Shinryu simply pulled off the cloth on his face, then smiled embarrassedly. Ahahaha. Long time no see, Hui Yao. You can call me kid. The first pagoda master smiled gently. Chapter 1343. How should she put it? It could only be described as fluent. The young man who gave her a golden apple spoke the language of the East. Little butterfly monster couldn't help but look at Long Shirua curiously. If she didn't hear wrongly, teacher? Long Shirua clenched her fist and coughed twice. When she opened her mouth, she was still very serious. This person is called Hui Yao. He used to have some relationship with me. Well, how should I put it? Anyway, it's a long story. Under the golden apple tree, the young man stood with his hands behind his back. It was hard to associate him with the origin of the so-called brat. The current First Tower Master of the Secret Arts Tower revealed a smile. Teacher, you seem to have changed recently. If it was in the past, you would probably say that I'm just a shameless brat. You only took me as your student and you never admitted it. Yes. Luo Dance nodded subconsciously. Yes, your ass. Kelowna Shinryu stared at this butterfly. Then she frowned and gave up. Well, I'm here to pick apples again today. What are you going to do? Do you want to fight with me or pretend that nothing happened? The first pagoda master. Hui Yao shook his head gently and said sincerely, Although it's one of my life's wishes to have a real battle with Master, I'm still very clear about the gap between Master and me. Besides, there are some troublesome things happening outside. I don't want to complicate things now. I'll lock up Qi Yen temporarily. If you like the apples here, you can take some back as a souvenir. As long as it's not like the last time, I'll tell Qi Yen that I picked some apples for him. This Eastern Shinryu's heart skipped a beat. Just like that profiteer, this type of guy was the most difficult to deal with. It was like punching the air. Just this one. Long Shirua shook her head. Looking at the golden apple in Butterfly Monster's hand, she said casually, I just wanted to make some for this little thing to eat. If there's nothing else, I'll leave. You don't have to see me off. With that, Long Shirua grabbed the little butterfly's arm without hesitation. Hui Yao smiled calmly. Teacher, before you leave, don't you plan to tell me what you did to Fafner? Fafner? What is Fafna? Long Shirua blinked. This name sounds familiar. I can't remember. Did I do something? Hui Yao heaved a sigh of relief and said slowly, Last time, Master said that he would find a way to solve the problem of the golden dragons giving birth. This time, when Teacher stepped into Fafner's territory, I thought that Teacher had already found a way. It seems that I was just overjoyed. Oh, you're talking about that. Kelowna's Shinryu nodded and covered the little butterfly's mouth. He said casually, I'm still thinking about it. This time I'm just traveling around the world and bringing this little thing to broaden her horizons. That's why I'm not willing to enter your inhuman domain. Don't worry, I'll come back when I think of a way. Thank you for your hard work, teacher. Hui Yao nodded and bowed deeply. This is not your duty, teacher, but you've been thinking about it. Since you're leaving now and I'm tied up with official business, I really can't send you off. By the way, the fire dragon tongue orchid in the Chinua Valley has bloomed. I know that teacher has a habit of drinking, so I asked someone to pick some and brew a few bottles. Initially, I wanted to take some time to bring it over. Since teacher is here, please take it. Just take it as a token of my appreciation. Also, there are some lotus seeds from the demonic sea. I know that teacher likes to eat them, so I picked some more. I'm sorry. There's also some bone powder from the golden griffin. It should be effective in making medicine. I'm really sorry. Oh, by the way, there are a few ancient relics from the East in the secret art tower. Let teacher take them back too. After all, when I was traveling in the East, I was really taken care of by the strange people in the East. Just take it as a token of appreciation. I'm really sorry. Is that enough? Damn brat. Kelowna's Shinryu said angrily. That's right. I'm the one who made that golden dragon go crazy. I'm planning to run away now. Hui Yao's face did not show any anger. He just said calmly, Can you tell me what happened, teacher? Long Shiro rubbed her forehead and sat on the grass. She raised her hands and said, I recently found a very strong aphrodisiac. I was going to let that idiot Fafnir use it. You should know about its situation, right? What's the use of letting it choose a concubine every now and then? It's better than doing nothing. The first pagoda master could only smile bitterly. On the one hand, I still have to consider old Fafnir's reputation. After all, it was a hero of the war. I can't let it be shamed after death. Speaking of the war, Kelowna's Shinryu opened his mouth. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he said something different. It's because of your overcautious personality that… Forget it. Long Shiro then shook her head. If it were me, I would have beaten that guy until he cried and looked for a mate, okay? So, Fafnir went crazy because he ate teacher's new drug? Hui Yao pretended not to hear this sentence. He then frowned and asked, What is the effect of this drug? How long will it last? According to the report I received, Fafnir went crazy. Now in front of the first pagoda, there are almost 10,000 victims crying and complaining. And there are still some who haven't arrived yet. What the… It's that strong? Kelowna's Shinryu subconsciously looked at the little butterfly next to him. His gaze was very subtle. The little butterfly was so embarrassed that she couldn't raise her head. Her face was red. The first pagoda master naturally couldn't figure out the origin of the raw material of this new drug. He just looked at it curiously. Seeing this, Long Shiro walked to the first pagoda master's side, then whispered in front of him about the drug's effect and the real reason why the golden dragon went crazy. Even with the first pagoda master's experience and cultivation, he still slightly opened his mouth when he heard this. He was stunned for a while, then he showed a trace of a bitter smile and sighed. I didn't expect. So that's the case. So, it's true that we didn't supervise it enough. We actually didn't find out about this. I only thought that it was a bit of a gender disorder. Shinryu-sama shook his head. Only you Westerners can accept it. If I were its parent, I would have directly destroyed it. Its body, hair, and skin belong to its parent. How can I just cut it off like that? If that's the case, Hui Yao suddenly said at this time, Please teach it well, teacher. Wait, what do you want to do? Long Shiro suddenly felt that something was wrong. Hui Yao said with a sincere face, For the time being, let's calm down Fafnir. I heard that it has now entered the territory of the 13 ancient clans. If we continue to let it run wild, even the Magician Association will not be able to face the dissatisfaction of the entire inhuman domain. Teacher, you're more or less involved in this matter. So, can you please accompany me to deal with it? Don't look at me like that. Kelowna's Shinryu sighed and said helplessly, Okay, I'll accompany you. Thank you, teacher. Hui Yao bowed deeply again. Okay. Long Shiro waved her hand impatiently. Hurry up. By the way, did you really lock up that bad-tempered crimson flame? Hui Yao, on the other hand, chuckled. He did not reply. Instead, he stretched out his hand and a strange magic wand that was much taller than him appeared in his hand. He tapped the ground lightly. On the ground, an auxiliary tactic array was cut open and absorbed them into it. The stream of light slowly rose up. In just the blink of an eye, there was no one under the golden apple tree. The territory of the Torito clan, the Lost Crack. The deep pit of corpses. The Golden Dragon and the Witch Maria were the last to return to the Red Dragon's skeleton residence. They saw the popular columnist, who had written half of the Inhuman newspaper, with a dejected look on his face at this time. At that moment, a Norman didn't care about that. After the last two entered, he hurriedly sealed the entrance and dug out some blue algae from the pile to ignite them. Because there was enough water, these strange algae would emit a lot of thick smoke when they were burning with a slightly rancid smell. Norman stuffed the smoldering algae into a few gaps. Finally, he extinguished all the unknown oil lamps that were lit, leaving only the faint light of the originally faint blue algae. Everyone's face seemed to be coated with a layer of blue seawater. Are these all preparations to prevent those things from coming? Finally, after Norman finished his work, Luaccio asked softly. However, after Norman's arrangement, this place was very quiet. Even a small voice could be heard clearly by everyone. When the beauty spoke, Huang Jinlong immediately became more alert. But when he saw the beauty sitting next to that ugly woman, Huang Jinlong could not help but frown. Beauty, don't be seduced by this ugly woman. She must be coveting your beauty. She is not sincere to you. Only I can understand you. We are from the same world. The shouting did not appear. From the outside, this columnist with the pseudonym of Milo-chan was still so noble and beautiful. Her sitting posture was as dignified as Miss Maid. The smell of these burning algae is the same as the smell of rotting corpses. It can effectively interfere with those things' sense of touch. Norman sat down again. I extinguished the oil lamp because, in addition to the faint light of these algae, those things are also sensitive to other light sources. If you want to talk, please try to keep it this way. Although there are soundproofing facilities here, it's best to keep it quiet. Luaccio was naturally not a person who was used to noise. At this time, he smiled slightly. Huang Jinlong, who was not far away, suddenly breathed faster. It seems that Mr. Norman is really familiar with this place. Boss Luo thought for a moment. Is this the experience gained from hunting down the crops that escaped here? Norman's gaze swept back and forth between Luaccio and the other two. Then, he glanced at the person who called herself Milo-chan and nodded as a response. At this time, as long as one stepped forward to speak, one could faintly hear some crawling sound. Rustle. It came from the deep pit of corpses outside through the ground. The witch rubbed her arms, then lowered her voice and said, "In this gloomy environment, it's like walking into a horror house. Speaking of which, it's a little boring to just sit like this. Why don't we talk about something?" She just subconsciously said something. In fact, she did not really intend to say anything. It was a kind of self-protection in an unfamiliar environment. A Norman had already closed his eyes. As for Mina, who was leaning against him, she was looking at everyone without any intention of speaking. Miss Witch could not help but look at her own side awkwardly. Milo-chan was considered half of one of them, right? In this case. Okay. Boss Luo smiled and said, "What do you want to say? How about?" For some reason, the Golden Dragon suddenly became energetic at this time. He smiled and said, "Since the atmosphere is good now, let's talk about a horror story? Beauty, I promise to scare you to death. Then, you can obediently go into my arms. I'll comfort you well." Miss Witch subconsciously squinted her eyes. As an Inhuman, would she really be frightened by a horror story? Although Inhuman also had things to be afraid of, she would definitely not be afraid of a story, right? What was Milo-chan's deep meaning? She originally wanted to use this time to ask Milo-chan for more advice in private. But everyone was gathered here. She was too embarrassed to open her mouth and ask the distressing questions of those older single women. Okay, let's talk about a horror story. Miss Witch finally raised her hand in agreement. Forget it, let's increase Milo-chan's favorability first. If it's a horror story, it's a bit. Boss Luo muttered at this time, there are children here. He looked at the girl next to a Norman, Mina. The girl suddenly smiled and said considerately, it's okay. If you want to say something, Mina will listen very carefully. Just now. Luocio waved his hand and took out a scroll that seemed to be made of animal skin. He slowly opened it and said slowly, when I went out for a visit, I accidentally found this thing. What is this? Miss Witch asked curiously. Boss Luo said, it seems to be a diary, but I only found this one. It seems to be incomplete. This should be written by the humans who lived here before. Since you want to listen to something, why don't we listen to the story of the humans who lived here before? Apart from Miss Maid, Huang Jinlong frowned, and Miss Witch seemed to be deep in thought. Mina, on the other hand, maintained her thoughtful smile, but her eyes flickered. A Norman. Busby slowly opened his eyes. At this time, Luo Qiu opened the handbook and spread it on the table. He drew the words on it with his finger and began to read softly, the 758th day. We have a very happy day today. Although we have to face cruel challenges and the death of our companions every day, these real things still make my heart beat strongly today. Chapter 1344. Gradually, people began to sit in a circle in the blue room. It was a circle with a gap. Luo Qiu's voice seemed to carry some kind of strange magic. However, he was just speaking normally. Unknowingly, some images seemed to be slowly unfolding in front of their eyes. The past of the humans who had once lived in this pit of corpses. The girl who was leaning against a Norman unknowingly hugged her knees and supported her chin with her hands. She didn't blink, as if she was attracted by the contents of the diary. The words written on this unknown animal skin diary were very small, so one had to use one's fingers to scratch line by line to not be dazzled. Perhaps, when the diary was writing these words, the owner of the diary was crouching in front of an oil lamp, looking very careful and cherishing. His voice was like a flowing mountain stream. Ding dong, ding dong. On the 820th day, something wonderful happened. This was the first time I did something with beakies, something I had never done before. I don't know why I did this kind of thing, it seemed to be an instinct. I had never learned this kind of knowledge. Even when we were in the farm, we were never taught these things. But, naturally, I kissed Beaky's lip. I felt the feeling of my heart beating was great. My blood seemed to be boiling crazily. I knew that Beaky's felt the same as me. I tried to undress her. I could even feel how my hands were trembling. The voice suddenly stopped. When everyone looked at him because of the interruption, Boss Luo blinked and said, well, let's skip it. Continue, continue. Miss Witch urged him subconsciously. Well, I don't have any objection. Golden Dragon said indifferently. This was not a diary, it was a pornographic novel. The beauty was reading a pornographic novel, of course, he couldn't let her stop. Of course, he had to continue. Luocio smiled and didn't care about the so-called embarrassing things. His voice became softer and his fingers scratched those small words again. I kissed her lips and Beaky's began to respond to me. I began to explore her skin with my hand. As if in response, her hands also touched my body. It seemed to be unconscious, as if she was eager. I could hear the sound of her panting. It was like the sound of piano keys going from weak to strong. My body began to change, it made me feel overwhelmed. I had never experienced this kind of thing before. But, I felt like I was sacrificing for the nobles in the castle. When the noble's fangs pierced my body, I felt like I was in the air. At this time, Beaky's suddenly reached out and held my. At this point, Boss Luo listened for a while. Then, he opened his mouth slightly and made a soft sound of ah. It was not a sound of surprise or horror, it was a moan sound. At this moment, when everyone looked at him because of the sound, Luocio said, "It's written here. Do you want to continue? Go. Go. Golden Dragon couldn't help but urge, and at the same time, he began to rub his nose. Miss Witch swallowed her saliva subconsciously. Miss Maid handled the matter calmly, but she was probably the most attentive one among all the listeners. Norman still didn't change at all. He didn't know when it started, but his eyes closed again. Mina was still the same as before. She seemed to be focused, but occasionally showed a trace of puzzlement, as if she didn't understand the contents of the diary. Then I'll continue. Boss Luo began to move his fingers again. Beaky's body began to show some changes that made me afraid. She began to vomit often and couldn't eat. Wait! Golden Dragon suddenly interrupted. Why did it suddenly jump? And it jumped so much? I've already said that the content of this handbook is incomplete. Boss Luo raised the animal skin handbook in front of everyone. There were a lot of wear and tear on it, and a large part in the middle was missing. You can continue, Golden Dragon said disappointedly. Mina seemed to be interested and suddenly asked softly, Master, what happened to Beaky's? Why is she not feeling well? After doing that kind of thing, she must be pregnant. Miss Witch rolled her eyes and said, Do you even need to ask? This Beaky's has a baby. The girl suddenly reached out her finger and lightly covered her mouth, then showed the content shyly. Yes, they kissed. The dormitory master said that kissing will give birth to a baby. It's not allowed. What about the 13 families? Golden Dragon suddenly sneered at this time. It had roughly understood the origin of this girl from Maria. The girl's eyes looked at Boss Luo again, as if she was very interested in what would happen next. Luocio just smiled and continued to read. Born a small life. We all felt unprecedentedly happy for the arrival of this small life, and also as we didn't know what to do. My companions told me that in this environment, it was too difficult to raise this small life. But this is my and Beaky's child. How can I give it up? Unknowingly, many of our female companions, like Beaky's, started to vomit. Their stomachs gradually swelled. I know that other than Beaky's and me, the other companions must have done that kind of thing. The small life will slowly increase, and the voices of opposition seemed to have stopped. Joy seemed to flow in everyone's heart along with Luocio's voice. Maybe the joy came from the handbook, but in this barren, gloomy, and difficult living environment, perhaps the people who lived here felt unprecedented joy because of the birth of a new life. Luocio's voice suddenly became lower. It was like a sudden sforzando sound. The sudden change. I killed my child with my own hands. I killed my child with my own hands. I killed my child with my own hands. It's a monster. It's a monster. Everyone's children turned into monsters. Killed, all killed. Everyone killed the children. What did we do wrong? Wait, what happened? Miss Witch was surprised. What happened to them? Luocio's fingers quickly drew a few lines on the animal skin, and then he slowly said, It seems that these children showed a strong aggressiveness when they were 1 or 2 years old. Well, there was mention of blood-sucking here. Perhaps it was some kind of mutation that made these children unstable between humans and vampires. Then, the people here killed all of these little life forms and buried their bodies. Mutation? Golden Dragon frowned, and his fingers twirled the long hair in front of him, and he muttered, It shouldn't be. The human species in the 13 ancient families, farm, were basically raised in captivity since ancient times. Later, after the inhuman territory was created, they moved in from the modern world. According to the 13 ancient families' nature, they must have tried their best to keep these ancient species pure. How could they have this kind of mutation? Could it be because of living in such an environment? Maria fell into deep thought. Miss Maid picked some blue algae, put it between her fingers, and gently crushed it. She also tried to smell the smell of the crushed algae. It's because they have been eating the algae growing here for a long time. At this time, Norman suddenly opened his eyes and said indifferently, Later, we studied it. These algae contain some substances similar to the noble factor. After the expedition, the wool crops that were recovered basically settled a lot on their bodies, and later they couldn't be used. Couldn't be used. What would happen after they couldn't be used? Norman didn't continue to say, but what would happen next could be roughly understood. As a human, Maria was silent at this time. She looked at the confused girl Mina, and saw that she didn't have any resistance to the crops that Norman kept saying. She couldn't help but feel sad. She wanted to say something. She really wanted to say something, but she couldn't open her mouth. What happened next, my lord? The girl Mina asked curiously at this time. Luaccio continued to read. I want to see beakies, I really want to see beakies. But this is forbidden, and I don't know how to do it. He paused and looked up at the rest of the content. It seems that after that, they began to restrain the contact between the opposite sex. Men and women lived separately, and only when the food was distributed, they would contact each other. But even so, both sides of the contact had to cover their whole body, and they couldn't even talk. Because they felt that once they had contact with the opposite sex, they couldn't help but do that kind of happy thing again, and then monsters would be born. Then, there began to be some suicides or crazy situations, and the population began to decrease again. Maria smiled bitterly. In this damn place, they couldn't be sure whether they would die or not, and there was absolute abstinence, and it was the first time these people tasted the forbidden fruit, so it should be the time when they desired it the most. It would be strange if they didn't go crazy. Sexual repression is too horrible. I think there must be some people who couldn't bear it and began to contact in private. Miss Maria, you seem to know it very well. Boss Luo smiled and said, the writer of this diary did break the rules between companions. He and Beakies began to meet secretly, and every time, they would choose a place where their companions didn't often go, and do what they thought was happy. Tsk. Men. Golden Dragon said in disdain, they are indeed creatures who think with their lower body. That's why I cough. Needless to say, this pair of bastards probably created another monster. And at this time, the woman's maternal instinct must have overflowed, and she secretly gave birth to the child, and finally caused a disaster. That's not true. Boss Luo said casually. The writer of the diary was very careful to use contraception every time. It was written like this, in order to prevent the tragedy from happening again. At least this man has some conscience. Golden Dragon shook his head. But it did cause a disaster. Luaccio immediately said. The relationship between the writer of the diary and Beakies was exposed. Because they broke the rules, they were exiled by their companions. And then? Miss Witch blinked her eyes. Luaccio shook his head. The diary ends here. This diary should be left behind by the writer before he was exiled. Golden Dragon said rather uninterestedly, although the ghosts in this place are not good, if they are just ordinary people, and they lost their shelter. I don't even need to think about it. Probably the two skeletons on the road are them, right? If they were hugging each other, it would be more poignant. I don't know what happened to the people living here. The girl who asked the question was Mina, who was listening to the past very carefully. She was not looking at Luaccio at this time, but at Norman, who was beside her. He only said indifferently, what happened to the owner of this diary was probably not long before our crusade against this place. Because the people who were brought back from here were still relatively young at that time. Most of them were between 30 to 40 years old. After saying that, Norman paused for a moment. Then, he continued calmly, according to the information given by the one who escaped, when we arrived here, the humans here were all in a state of frenzied self-indulgence. Mating scenes could be seen everywhere. Perhaps they would have died by the time we arrived a little later. Probably the topic fell into a cliff-like silence. After a while, in order to liven up the atmosphere, Miss Witch began to tell some cold jokes. This was probably the natural skill of people with British nationality. Everyone had their own thoughts. Boss Luo did not say anything, but just handed the animal skin diary to Miss Maid and asked her to keep it. This was one of her master's hobbies. He always liked to collect some small things. The two looked at each other and smiled, naturally understanding each other's meaning. This small eye contact naturally made the golden dragon jealous, but he still maintained his demeanor. Miss Maid just pretended not to see and did not know anything. After casually glancing at the animal skin diary, her eyes stopped at the last line of the diary, the last sentence. This was the content that her master did not read in front of everyone. Norman, the last words. Miss Maid did not say anything, but gently rolled up the animal skin diary. In the end, she considerately tied the animal skin with a handkerchief, finally tied a delicate bow, and then put it away. Chapter 1345. The light poured down and connected with the circle that emerged from the ground. When the light disappeared, in front of a cliff, the first tower master of the secret arts tower, Kelowna's Shinryu, and the little butterfly monster from the pet hospital landed at the same time. The cliff in front of them was steep. Obviously it wasn't a garden with golden apple trees. Okay, this is the territory of the Torito clan, one of the 13 clans, the first tower master said slowly. The first tower master slowly said, according to the feedback, this should be the last place where Fafnir was active. Feedback? The little butterfly monster looked around curiously. Kelowna's Shinryu said casually, this inhuman domain you're in was built by this guy. It's like the framework needed to build a building. He controlled most of the information network of the inhuman domain. And at the same time, he could use the power generated by the operation of these reference arrays to make long-distance jumps. Before coming here, didn't he stop for a few moments? That's because he used the connection between different arrays. What, you don't understand? What top student? Let's put it this way, do you know about aeroglide chess? This guy has a dice that can be used to throw, and it's a dice that can control the number of points at will. He can fly as many points as he wants. Don't tell me that the dice have a maximum of 6 points, I'm just giving an example. That's amazing. In short, the little butterfly monster clenched her small fist and looked at the first tower master with admiration. Aeroglide chess and dice. That's a good image. By the way, Sister Long, does the boss also have this kind of dice? Why did you mention that guy? Kelowna's Shinryu's mood became even worse. That guy is very bad, don't believe him in the future. The little butterfly monster was startled and couldn't help but scratch her head. She sighed with grievance and said, Sister Long, it seems that you must hate the boss. Why do you say that? Long Shiro frowned. In fact, she did not know why she discussed too much about the profiteer in front of Hui Yao. She wondered what kind of expression the first tower master would have when he knew that the place that was destroyed by the war 100 years ago had been revived. The little butterfly blinked and said, because there was one time when you finished your afternoon nap, you finished the 48th. Damn profiteer. How could something like this happen? Kelowna's Shinryu couldn't control the situation, but his expression didn't change as he snorted. Now do you know how much I hate this profiteer? But, Sister Long, you called the boss's name 96 times. Poof. Shinryu's sure kill technique, solar storm spin. Kelowna's Shinryu started twisting the little butterfly's head with his fingers. No wonder I keep feeling that the hospital's hygiene is not clean recently. So you're slacking off. What the hell are you doing? You have time to count the number of times I sleep talk, but don't you have time to clean up? Ouch! While they were fooling around like this, they suddenly met the gaze of the first pagoda master, only to see him smiling and patiently looking at them. There was even a faint trace of envy in his eyes. Kelowna's Shinryu let go of Luo dance embarrassedly. Don't mind him, we're just talking about a profiteer who eats people without spitting out their bones. You won't know him even if I tell you. Hui Yao did not ask further. He just nodded his head. However, at this moment, he suddenly raised his head and looked at the sky. He saw a small black shadow flying across the sky. It seemed like a flying blanket. There seemed to be a figure sitting on the blanket, but the person on the blanket didn't notice the first tower master on the ground. He directly went deep into the territory of Torito clan. That person is Secret Steel? The first tower master frowned slightly, whispering, "Why is he an acquaintance?" Long Shirua cast an inquiring look. The first tower master nodded and said, "He's one of the tower masters of our secret arts tower, and also the youngest tower master. Due to his achievements in the war back then, as well as his ability, he was officially promoted to Tower Master of the Secret Arts Tower 20 years ago under the joint proposal of several Tower Masters. Originally, I planned to let Secret Steel deal with the victims, but I was told that he suddenly went out more than an hour ago. I didn't expect that he would come here. It seems a bit strange." Long Shiro waved her hand and said, "I'm not interested in gossiping about the actions of your Secret Arts Tower's members. Hurry up and find Fafnir and beat him up. Once that's done, I'll go home." If beating him up could solve the problem, he would have beaten him up personally decades ago. The first tower master shook his head slightly and then said, "Let's move on. About 10 kilometers away, I feel a strong and chaotic magic residue. I hope Fafnir didn't do any damage to Torito clan. Although the 13 clans are divided internally, they can always unite against external forces. It's very troublesome." With that, the first tower master raised the huge magic wand in his hand and drew a circle on the ground. A round clay tablet directly split open from the ground, and then floated up. At this time, the first tower master directly walked on this clay tablet, and motioned Long Shiro and Luodance to walk on it. He stood at the front, and began to drive this clay tablet to move rapidly in the air. At this time, Kelowna's Shinryu glanced at it, and then put one hand on Butterfly Monster's shoulder, and they squatted down. At this time, Long Shiro quietly covered Butterfly Monster's ears and asked, Did I say anything else when we were sleeping?" Butterfly Monster tilted her head, and then nibbled her fingers, saying, "Well, it seems that there are some strange words." "What did I say?" Kelowna's Shinryu suddenly raised his voice, and seemed to be faintly sweating. "Well, don't hit me? Even my father didn't hit me like this? It's always strange words, and then, bad guy. Oh yes, bad guy has been called 172 times. Sister Long, is bad guy also a boss? Dance." At this time, Kelowna's Shinryu showed a kind of unprecedented gentleness, and then gently stretched out her hands, gently holding Luodance's face. Gradually, she squeezed Butterfly Monster's face and pouted her mouth. Little Butterfly Monster blinked her eyes, not knowing what her elder sister Long was planning to do. But she suddenly felt a little dizzy, as if her eyes were constantly spinning. At the same time she seemed to hear elder sister Long's voice. "Forget everything you saw, forget everything you saw, forget. Finally, the little Butterfly Monster foamed at the mouth and fainted in the arms of the true dragon of the godly land. Yes, her eyeballs were still rolling. The first tower master turned back at this time. The sensitive Shinryu directly glared at him and sneered, "Little devil, concentrate on driving." "Little devil," the first tower master at this time said softly, "I'm suddenly very interested. Teacher's different changes from the past, is it related to the person you mentioned?" Long Shiro immediately narrowed her eyes and smiled. "Little devil, is it because you haven't felt despair for a long time and your body is itchy?" The first tower master said softly, "Teacher, don't you realize it yourself?" "Realize what?" Kelowna's Shinryu frowned. He said softly, "You smile more than before." At this moment, the true dragon of the divine land suddenly opened his eyes wide. At the same time, he stretched out his finger and pointed to the front. Hui Yao was stunned. He turned around and saw a huge building that was built in the middle of the cliff. It was so badly damaged that it was unbearable to look at. "It seems," the first tower master moaned powerlessly, Our golden dragon seems to have too much energy. A high-speed magic carpet came to an abrupt stop at the ruins of the castle and then slowly floated down. At this time, from the magic carpet, a burly man walked down directly. The moment he landed, the sound of metal armor walking could be heard. The man's skin that was exposed outside of his clothes had a kind of golden luster. Even his brow bone was a fusion of metal and bone, protruding high. But he did not look scary, only strange. At this time, the man's eyes looked forward and soon found his target. Sitting on a broken wall, with a bottle of wine beside him, and holding a quill and a letter in his hand, was a werewolf who was thinking hard. Kaloya. I was wondering who it was. I thought it might be another survivor of the 13 clans, but I didn't expect it to be you. Kaloya heard the movement and naturally, he did not pretend that he did not hear it and quickly responded, Mithril, long time no see. Kaloya. The man, the Mithril Tower Master frowned at this time and looked around. There's still a very strong magic residue here. Why, did you and Baligan start a fight here? I would like to. Kaloya shrugged. But I don't have the hobby of fighting in front of other people's houses and wreaking havoc on their people. This is the work of old Fafnir's descendant. As for the reason, why, wasn't that little dragon brought under the management of the Magician Association? Don't you know? I came all the way here after receiving Baligan's messenger. The Mithril Tower Master shook his head. Along the way I saw many destroyed places, and I thought it was them. Since it concerned them, the Mithril Tower Master naturally could not spare more thought for the golden dragon that had wreaked havoc here. However, perhaps it was a taboo for the survivors of the Great War, something that they wouldn't easily mention. Even the cheerful and magnanimous Kaloya, a legendary hero past his prime, was silent at the moment. It should be true, Kaloya said without rhyme or reason. The Mithril Tower Master, however, understood, and his expression grew somber. It was after a while that he said, Baligan? Let's wait for him. Kaloya waved his hand and said, This place has been destroyed to this extent. As the acting Grand Duke, he has to be busy for some time. Besides, if it's them, even if we have a few more years, what can we do? Come and have a drink with me? This year's malt harvest is good, and I personally brewed some malt wine. Mithril sat down but did not speak. He suddenly said, According to the information from the modern world, Farrell escaped from the island prison in Britain the night before yesterday. Something happened in Britain. Just last night there was internal strife among the knights, and in the end, even the Holy Grail that they held was destroyed. What? Kaloya opened his mouth in shock, then lowered his head and frowned. Then, he gulped down a mouthful of malt wine as if he was digesting the information. After a while, he let out a sigh and said, I have a feeling that the rest of us will gather together very soon. When that time comes. Oh right, are you really not going to take a bite? Mithril frowned, but this time, he reached out his hand and took the wine pot from Kaloya's hand. The two legendary heroes were thinking about something in silence. At the edge of the castle ruins, from the huge crack below, there was a rapid airflow rushing out. Perhaps it was the vibration of air pressure or something else. It sounded like the roar of a wild beast. It's really hard for those guys from the 13 families. There are some unknown things under the nest of each family. Won't they be unable to sleep if they roar like this every day? Kaloya shook his head. What a bunch of thick-skinned guys. The Mithril Tower Master felt that when it came to thick-skinned nerves, the legendary werewolf hero beside him was probably the strongest among the inhuman. At the bottom of the crack, the sound of wind whistling or the roar of wild beasts sounded. It was unknown whether it was the sound of wind whistling or the roar of wild beasts. The diary on the Animal Skin Handbook had been read, and the people in the skeleton residence had stopped talking at some point. Miss, which was currently wrapped in her own clothes, leaning against a bone that looked like a rib, and began to sleep lightly. The young girl, Mina, also leaned on Norman's shoulder and seemed to have fallen into a deep sleep. Golden Dragon Fafnir was looking around quietly. Although he still looked dignified, he had thought of dozens of ways to strike up a conversation with the beauty, but he rejected them one by one. It was either too impulsive or too old-fashioned. The ugly woman beside the beauty was too much of a hindrance. The Golden Dragon's eyes narrowed slightly. At this moment, Boss Luo and Miss Maid were playing a small game. Their hands and fingers were wrapped around a rope made of plant fibers that they picked up from the ground, and they began to play a flower rope game. Dong dong, dong dong. A sound suddenly sounded in the whistling wind, and it came from the entrance of the Red Dragon's skeleton house that was blocked by Norman. It sounded like someone was knocking on the door. Dong dong, dong dong. It was rhythmic. Dong dong, dong. Chapter 1346. The continuous knocking sound made the owner and Miss Maid stop their fingers, and at the same time, it also woke Maria up from her light sleep. Norman had opened his eyes at some point in time. He followed the source of the sound and looked towards the entrance of the residence, the huge mouth of the Red Dragon's corpse. What happened? Maria quickly stood up. Didn't you say those things won't find this place? It doesn't seem to be those things. Luocho glanced at it and whispered, "It's something else." Something else, what? Maria couldn't help swallowing her saliva. At this time, Norman walked directly to the temporarily closed entrance. His footsteps were unusually light, as if his weight had already disappeared, like a passing shadow. There seemed to be some sort of mechanism at the entrance. Norman slowly turned on one of the dragon's teeth at the side of the huge mouth, and a faint sound could be heard. It seemed that nothing had changed, but the many bones used to seal the entrance suddenly loosened a little, a crack about half a finger wide. At this moment a Norman moved closer to the crack. The moment his line of sight passed through the crack and caught a glimpse of the outside world, a Norman instantly shifted his line of sight away. He turned back and looked at the people inside. Although his expression didn't change much, there seemed to be a trace of doubt and nervousness in his eyes. But soon, he once again looked at the crack in front of him. He didn't speak for a long time. What's outside? You say something? Maria couldn't help but whisper. Norman slowly looked away at this time, and then stepped back step by step. His movements were as silent as before. He returned to the crowd and met their gazes. After a while, he squeezed out a voice, I don't know what it is. It seems to be a child. Child? What child? Miss Witch was stunned. Boss Luo looked at Yu at this time. Miss Maid understood, got up and walked directly to the position where Norman used to observe the outside world, and began to look around. At this time, the pit of corpses was still filled with the faint light of blue algae. Those strange and extremely aggressive vines were now everywhere. They looked like spider webs, but also like blood vessels. They were attached to the piles of corpses and wriggled aimlessly on the ground. But other than these things, there were dozens of small figures outside. They were slowly walking in the pit of corpses. Very small. Really small. The figures of naked children that were only as tall as one's calf. They were either staggering about or crawling slowly on the ground. They didn't speak. They didn't even have any communication. These naked children were covered in mud, and at the same time, there was a strange smile on their faces. Their eyes were not like those of ordinary people, they were completely black. There was also the intermittent laughter coming from the children's mouths. The vines of the lost Fong, that would attack any living creature, seemed to have turned a blind eye at this moment. They allowed these small figures to crawl, walk, and even roll in their territory. Under the faint blue light, their skin seemed to be gray, but also seemed to be grayish-black. Perhaps they should have been pale in color. Perhaps it was because Miss Maid was too calm, so Maria, driven by curiosity, gradually came closer. Through a small crack, she also learned to peek at everything outside. But almost in the next moment, she directly reached out to cover her mouth, and the edge of her eyes began to twitch slightly. At this time, Yi just glanced at Maria casually, then moved lightly and returned to her master's side. Without being as careful as the book, Norman, Miss Maid said in her usual tone, it should be some spirits. Then, Miss Maid described what she saw to Luaccio, and then she continued, I read in the diary that the people living here once killed all the mutated offspring. Probably because of the mutation, their spiritual power is stronger than ordinary children, so they became spirits after death. As for the environment here, after absorbing the death aura for a long time, the spirits directly turned into wraiths. That's roughly it. Although this was an inference, Miss Maid's inference had never been wrong since Luaccio met her. So it's just some wraith. The Golden Dragon didn't care too much after hearing that. For the last Golden Dragon, no matter if it was a frontal attack or a sneak attack, it would be defeated by the Shinryu in the east. However, except for the violent old woman Long Shirua, Fafnina was really not afraid of anyone, at least in the inhuman domain. There was no one that could scare it out of its wits. Of course, there were a few people who would be scrupulous. The Golden Dragon lost interest, but Boss Luo was now interested. Now, Luaccio would not give up any moment that would make him interested. Even before he thought about it, he had already stood up. But when he was about to take a closer look, something unexpected happened. For some reason, Maria stood motionless at the entrance. It was as if she had not heard the conversation inside. Suddenly, she twisted her neck. It was a very uncoordinated and strange twisting posture. Her eyes suddenly lost their white color. Without speaking, Maria suddenly waved the magic wand in her hand. A lightning-like electric light shot out from the magic wand and directly blew up the skeleton that Norman used to block the entrance. Just as this abnormal change happened to Maria and destroyed the seal on the entrance, a figure shot out like lightning. "Oh, Norman!" He flashed in front of Maria at an extremely fast speed. Without any warning, he raised his hand and punched Maria's abdomen, knocking her directly to the ground. But it was also at this time that the lost fungus tentacle-like terrifying vines appeared at the destroyed entrance. They grew from all around and spread out in an instant. In a flash, they had covered the entire entrance. Norman's legs had even been entangled by the roots of these vines. He was quite decisive and waved his palm. While his fingertips became sharp, he directly tore the vines under his legs. But a scream came from the residence. It was the young girl Mina's scream of horror. The roots had invaded the residence, and at this time, the young girl Mina's legs and below her waist had been entangled with a layer of wriggling vine root. Norman's pupils turned blue in an instant, and at the same time, he opened his mouth slightly, revealing the vampire's fangs, at a faster speed, like a gust of wind. The roots on the young girl's body were instantly broken, and she was already in Norman's arms. Because he needed to save Mina, he naturally didn't care about Maria, who had fainted on the ground. The moment he left, the roots had already wrapped around Maria. Instead, Fafnir took action and released a handful of dragon flames to burn the roots at the entrance. Then, he brought Maria back. Although he hated women, he could not allow his readers to be hurt in front of him and remain indifferent. Miss Maid retreated to Luaccio's side, looking down at the vines that were approaching step by step. When she was about to make a move, the golden dragon's fingers had already waved. The bright red dragon flame burned instantly, burning all the surrounding roots to ashes. The flames reflected the golden dragon's face, making it look even brighter. In the light of the flames, the golden dragon chuckled and said, "No one, don't be afraid, I will protect you. These things, I will be back soon. Take a good look at my heroic appearance." With that, Fafnir, Mina, laughed and rushed out. With a grunt, it rushed out of the entrance, and as it walked, the flowing fire spread out in all directions. Norman didn't speak, but he directly carried Mina. This place had been invaded, and if he stayed, he would only be like a trapped beast. He needed to leave this narrow space, at least to ensure his own vision. He didn't even greet the boss and the maid. The moment the golden dragon rushed out, he also rushed out very quickly. Boss Luo glanced at Miss Maid at this time, and then walked to Maria's side. Just as he was about to approach, Maria, who was originally knocked out by Norman, suddenly opened her eyes. It was still those completely black eyes. After Maria opened her eyes, she directly opened her mouth, and the sound deep in her throat was like the hiss of a snake, but also like the roar of a beast. She suddenly stretched out her hands, trying to strangle Luocchio's neck. She was fast, but Miss Maid was countless times faster than her. Maria didn't even fully stretch out her hands, but Miss Maid's 5 fingers had already directly grabbed her forehead, and then directly pressed her to the ground. Half of her head was almost buried in the soil. Without any words, Miss Maid's eyes were like blue ice crystals. She raised her hand, and a cross sword condensed by black smoke directly flashed out. She whispered in Maria's ear, "Maria, are you hoping that I have a legitimate reason to directly pierce through your heart?" Maria's eyes suddenly showed a trace of pain. Then, she let out a tragic cry, and a black gas rushed out from her mouth. Finally, black particles gathered in the air. It was a black hair, black pupils, and a naked little boy about 1 or 2 years old, who looked like a 1 or 2-year-old, with a strange appearance. After spitting out the black gas, Maria fainted again. At this time, this resentful spirit that invaded Maria's body, controlled her body, and destroyed the entrance, and in a flash, rushed toward Luocchio. Miss Maid's hand turned over and the black flame-crossed sword in her hand shot out. The moment this resentful spirit rushed out, it was directly nailed in one of the ribs of the red dragon's skeleton residence by the crossed sword. It was like all the creatures that suffered this kind of extreme punishment, struggling crazily with both pain and fear. "Is Miss Maria all right?" Seeing this, Boss Luo asked softly. "She just fainted, and when I stopped her, 3 of her ribs were broken." Miss Maid smiled slightly. "It should be no big deal. In addition, 2 of them should be caused by the fist of a Mr. Vampire." She meant that one of the ribs was accidentally broken or something like that. Luocchio opened his mouth slightly, and then walked toward the resentful spirit that was nailed to the bones. It couldn't get rid of the crossed sword, and at the same time, the flame on the sword was constantly burning its entire body. This was the source of its painful howl. Luocchio waved his hand to stop the flame on the crossed sword, or to stop the flame from leaking out, just maintaining the shape of the sword. Because the flames stopped burning, the resentful spirit seemed to be in less pain after being nailed to the bones. It temporarily stopped struggling. He came to the front of the resentful spirit, looking straight into its black pupils. "Just now, was it you who knocked on the door?" It didn't even have eyelids, and its black eyes just looked, and didn't make any sound. "Is this your home?" Luocchio asked softly again, in the past. It was completely quiet, and its head slowly turned from the left to the right, and from the right to the left. Then, it slowly stretched out its hand. It opened its mouth, as if it was learning to speak, uttering some unknown syllables. Luocchio gave it a real response, and also stretched out his finger. In the air, its small finger finally touched Luoccio's finger. Boss Luo slowly closed his eyes. The roots of the lost fangs grew again, and invaded the red dragon skeleton's residence again. This time, there was no golden dragon that wanted to show its heroic appearance. The golden dragon was attacking recklessly in the skeleton pit, but it could be easily guessed from the movement. There was also no vampire that called himself a Norman. But there was Miss Maid beside Boss Luo. When Luocchio closed his eyes and touched the resentful spirit in front of him, Miss Maid whispered in an emotionless voice, "Don't disturb my master. Otherwise, I don't mind digging you out from the ground and sending you to the sun to burn." Cain. The wildly growing roots suddenly began to wither. After a while, the roots that had grown in the residence suddenly became dry and cracked. Luocchio suddenly opened his eyes, and then stretched out his other hand to the maid and smiled. "You come too." So Miss Maid smiled, and moved to her master's side. Her fingers wrapped around his, and then she slowly closed her eyes. What opened was the resentful spirit's short life memory. Meanwhile, outside the red dragon skeleton residence, the golden dragon Fafnir had turned into an arsonist in order to win a smile from a beauty. Chapter 1347. Only a little flame was needed, and it had the possibility to burn infinitely. The flame released by the golden dragon was like that. Like a queen of flames, huge fireballs were released from Fafnir's palm. No matter how many roots there were, no matter how fast they grew, they couldn't resist the burning speed of these flames. However, the lost crack was so big that it covered the entire territory of the 13 clans in the inhuman domain. And this was only the lost crack, where the Torrido clan was located. These vines and the fibrous roots that grew out of them were endless. These fibrous roots only had simple instincts. However, after they were enraged by this place, the Lost Fangs, in the crack below the Torridor clan went on a rampage. At the edge of the corpse pit, countless vines were entangled. They covered the entire slope of the pit and even higher. Like huge waves of vines, they came down wave after wave. In an instant, the entire corpse pit became the territory of these blood-sucking vines. On the ground, the intertwined greenish-black blood-sucking vines were like a coarsely woven carpet. Then, from the ground, vines that were as big as 2 people drilled out of the ground one after another like long worms. They twisted their bodies and were dozens of meters tall. Fafnir still didn't care and released its dragon flame to its heart's content. However, it didn't realize that its body was sweating a lot. All of a sudden, it felt a sense of emptiness in its body. The golden dragon had a huge amount of magic, but at this moment it felt powerless. Not only was the recovery of magic elements in the surroundings very little, but more importantly, there was actually a problem with its own body. It was a problem of physical strength. At this time, Fafnir's state was like a boxer who was about to defend his title, but the night before the final battle, he was wildly indulging and had sex with a few prostitutes. After the first round, he was sweating profusely and his legs were weak. It was commonly known as kidney deficiency. The terrifyingly powerful dragon flames were suddenly engulfed by the waves of vines and then annihilated. Then, dozens of huge blood-sucking vines that were as thick as 2 people simultaneously shot out countless fishline-like fibrous roots, binding Fafnir's body, 4 limbs, and that waist and abdomen. Facing this situation, the golden dragon's powerless feeling became more and more obvious. It even started to gasp for breath. Of course, even if it was gasping, it was still very pleasant to hear. After all, it was indeed a very close to perfect, well, a creature. Fafnir, blow it up! A huge dragon roar erupted from its mouth. Although it didn't really say what it was shouting in its heart, at this point, whether it loved beauty or had the heart of a writer, it was still a dragon in nature. Furthermore, it was the last golden dragon. The ferocity of a dragon was completely aroused at this moment. Finally, the golden dragon whose legs were weak was covered by layers of entangled roots. It was so tight that it finally became a huge cocoon. Seeing that the mysterious woman who called herself Milo-chan was finally trapped in the roots of the lost Fang, a Norman, who was holding the young girl Mina with both hands, was constantly relying on the bat wings on his back to avoid the vine's pursuit. His face suddenly became more serious. Facing the endless vines, a Norman couldn't rush out of the lost rift in the end. He couldn't even rush out of the pit of corpses here. The waves of these vines directly covered him, and the young girl Mina was drowned in this terrifying sea of plants. When the resistance no longer existed, the entire pit of corpses was now at least half as deep as usual. This was because more than half of the lost fungus vines and fibrous roots were already filled here. In other words, after the death of the first vampire, there were still active capillaries in its body. Only the strange algae growing on the cliffs on both sides still emitted a soft blue light. In the end, this place finally returned to a strange silence. And in this heavy silence, there were only the vengeful spirits of the children. They were either playing or crawling on the sea of vines. They were scattered all over the place. In the sea of vines, a large number of vines would automatically weave into various shapes at this time, slides, mounts, or dolls. It was like accompanying these vengeful spirits. A strange and silent playground just appeared in this sea of vines that drowned the entire pit of corpses. At the same time, buried deep in the bottom of the sea of vines, which was the original pit of corpses, in the shelter built by the humans who once lived here. It was a house built with the skeleton of a red dragon. Around the house and even above it, there was an empty space at this time. The vines seemed to weave into a basket, covering the house upside down, and then began to harden. After hardening, the vines were like iron branches, effectively blocking the unconscious growth of the root. In the house, between Luaccio and this little vengeful spirit, the place where their fingers touched was like a glimmer of starlight, illuminating the surroundings. What opened was some fragments of its short life. Maybe it was a fictional past, or maybe it was a real past, when the boss and Miss Maid slowly opened their eyes in this past. It was still the original pit of corpses, but it was more lively than when Boss Luo and Miss Maid first came here. It was the same color, the same pile of corpses, and the same residents, but there was a faint road. It was a road that was sorted out, a road that people could walk on, and not scattered all over the ground, a mess of corpses and people. The descendants of the ancients who once lived here and escaped from the vampires' farm. Because it was just a projection, the Wu people here naturally didn't know that there was a strange man and woman beside them. They would never know, because strictly speaking, for them who appeared at this moment, the boss and Miss Maid belonged to the future. This was the past. In addition, there was sunlight here. It didn't rely on the eerie light released by the special algae, but sunlight. It was transparent, seemed to have real heat, and could be clearly distinguished by shadows. There was light accompanied by a breeze, but there was no sun. This was also why Boss Luo's first impression was vitality. This place. The maid naturally saw the clues. But Luochu shook his head slightly. He looked at the people in front of him, and then walked over. This place was naturally different from what was described in the animal skin diary. At least, based on the current situation, the environment was slightly different from what was recorded in the diary. He saw a lot of food, made into various kinds of dry food, and placed in front of each house. The part of the edge of the deep pit was reclaimed into a field, and the men were farming in the field. As for the women, they were collecting berries near the field, or kneading the fibers of plants into lines in front of the house. They were using crude bone needles to make clothes. Some were also raising the newborn children. Luocio heard a woman's soft singing voice. Through the window supported by bones in the house, a mother was gently pushing the cradle. Inside the cradle was a sleeping child who had just come to this world not long ago and had not fully opened his eyes. Send a wish, let the stars take it away. Doing this work will let you go further. Send a wish, let the stars take it away. You, who drew the map, will also be at a certain place on the map. Wave your hand, send a wish. A last wish before his death. Wave your hand, send a wish. Save all your failed souls, it will let the child sleep better. A lullaby from the mother. Not long after, the man carried the day's harvest and returned home. The man put down the heavy basket on his back and walked to the cradle with a smile. He lowered his head and kissed the woman. Then, he bent down even lower and kissed the sleeping child. At this moment it seemed that he really existed in this past, as if he could really wake up the men, women, and sleeping children. Luocio put his finger to his lips and made a soft gesture to Miss Maid. He was even unwilling to speak, for fear of breaking the peace at this time. On the cleaner road, the boss and Miss Maid gradually came to a more open place. There was a square with all kinds of strange decorations. This feeling was similar to the farm of the clan. The ancients in a farm received all kinds of education and were given different personas. Even though they were of the same age, their culture, sense of beauty, and knowledge were all different. Only the most unique crop could be considered a high-class delicacy. But Luaccio hadn't found the figure of the little vengeful spirit, although it was the link of the past and the future in this short period of time. Perhaps it was because of its perspective, so it didn't appear. Or it was just hiding. Luaccio felt that it was more like it was hiding, playing a game of hide-and-seek. Both of them looked at a pillar made of many unknown bones at the side at the same time. They saw a small figure sticking its head out at this moment and then quickly retreating. Who else could it be if it wasn't the little vengeful spirit that invaded Maria? But when the master and the servant came to the white bone pillar, the little vengeful spirit had already walked away, into the disordered and orderly a street of white bones. It would frequently look back, as if it was a timid but particularly naughty little monster that came out to make trouble at Halloween. It seemed to lead them to somewhere. They followed it. The surroundings changed into a thick fog that came suddenly and then disappeared suddenly. They were already at the edge of the pit of corpses. It stopped in front of a cave entrance at the bottom of the pit. After looking back at Luaccio and Miss Maid for the last time, it plunged into the cave and disappeared. They didn't intend to follow it in, because they had already felt that someone was about to walk out of the cave, but the figure just came to the edge of the cave. At the edge where the sunlight couldn't reach, where the shadow and the light met, a figure could be vaguely seen. The little vengeful spirit was hiding at the foot of the figure at this time, and then timidly poked its head out. A voice came from the cave entrance. This was the voice of the figure. It was a low, slightly hoarse, and even old voice. It has been a long, long time since an outsider came here. The last time, it was a pair of lovers who were about to die. The figure that didn't walk out of the cave entrance was obviously different from all the humans here. It could talk to the boss and Miss Maid, which at least proved that he had some connection with the little vengeful spirit. Lovers who were about to die. But Luaccio wasn't in a hurry to inquire about the origin of the figure, but he was more curious about the lovers who were about to die. It said casually, he used to live here in the past. At least in your eyes, it was the past. Well, don't stand there. If you don't mind, come in and sit down. This child rarely brings people here. He should like you more. I'll treat him well. Then, sorry to bother you. Luaccio nodded with a smile, and walked into the cave randomly. After passing through the sunlight and walking into the darkness, they found that it wasn't completely dark here. The disappeared cracks and algae reappeared in this cave, and the faint blue light illuminated everything. Boss Luo naturally saw the appearance of the person who was talking to him. He was wearing a linen robe, which was broken at the knees. His hair didn't take care of itself, and it grew naturally, hanging down to his chest. He was thin and his face was old. At the same time, his eyes seemed to be dug out by something, leaving only 2 deep eye sockets. At least, he was an old and blind man, judging from his appearance. But since he appeared here, he naturally wouldn't have any relationship with ordinary people. I didn't scare you, did I? The old man walked slowly in front. He was very familiar with this place. Even if he couldn't see, his footsteps didn't have any hesitation. He said in a low voice, I don't know what I look like now, but last time I should have scared them. I think it shouldn't be as bad as you think, Luaccio said casually. The old man didn't look back. He just laughed. Yes, although it's a bit obscure, I can feel that you at least have some ability compared to the pair of lovers last time. You'll probably be afraid of a guy with no ability like me. But I'm curious. How did you escape the attack of the tusks and let this little guy bring you here? Sir, is this the interior of Lost Tusk? Luaccio suddenly asked. The old man said, Not entirely. Perhaps I'm it, but it's not me. At this moment, Miss Maid, who hadn't spoken, suddenly whispered after seeing her master's thoughtful gaze, Have you forgotten me, Cain? At the same time, Miss Maid's body exuded a trace of special fluctuation. The old man walking in front with the little resentful spirit suddenly stiffened and stopped. After a while, he slowly turned around. I don't think so, but I don't know if my memory is wrong. So, girl of New Orleans, please tell me. Which world is this? Hashtag 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 PS1. Happy New Year, Bow. PS2. Thank you for little artillery asterisk modified 3 times in a row. Is it really okay to pamper me 3 times at once? Your body won't be weak. In short, serving tea to the capitalist forces and rubbing their legs for the New Year's special service. PS3. The progress of the last update is 16/30. There are still 14 chapters left. So now it's 14 plus 8 is equal to 22 chapters. Why is it 8 and not 6? I won't tell you about the existence of strange transactions. PS4, 22 chapters, I will try my best. So, this year, please give me more advice? Cough cough. Advice. Chapter 1348. The answer from the old man made Miss Maid slightly surprised. Under the situation where her master blocked her perception, it was difficult for her to make the most accurate judgment based on the current information. Boss Luo seemed to like to see the appearance of something that could embarrass Miss Maid, and then make a puzzled expression. He still didn't have any intention to release the shield. Of course, he was like that himself. It was like a small game played by couples, where they looked at each other and competed to see who couldn't hold back their laughter first, or who couldn't help but blink first. Maybe it seemed a little unrestrained, but after the origin behind the club granted them the true meaning of immortality, they probably had the capital to be unrestrained. Quietly looking at Miss Maid's rare thoughtful expression, Luocio couldn't help but want to take out the camera to take a good picture of her at this moment. But he was afraid that he would miss this rare moment if he fiddled with the camera. Or let his eyes remember. You are the reborn consciousness of Cain? This was the question Yu Yi asked after thinking. She seriously looked at everything about the old man in front of her. The old man nodded and then slowly said, Originally, when I was passing through the dimensional crevice, I encountered an unprecedented terror. Now I have almost lost all my memories of that period. I only vaguely remember that terrifying name. Void Azura. Void Azura? Luocio thought. He had met the creature of Void original demon, and the core material of the reconstruction of the club's Black Soul Envoy's body was the loose source of foreign body, extracted from this creature. The current me knows nothing about Void Azura. The old man shook his head. The original me fell into this subworld. Fortunately, this subworld also had the legend of me, so the original me exhausted the last of my strength to embed me into part of the history of this world, and then completely disappeared. As for the current me, I was born from this part of history, and I inherited part of the original me's knowledge and memory. Of course, I also inherited the memory of the transaction with you. Come to think of it, this part of the memory was left behind because the original me felt that it was necessary to remember it, right? However, the current me doesn't know if the original me deviated or hid anything when I left it behind. Old man. When Cain said this, Boss Luo understood what was going on. Cain's reincarnated consciousness was theoretically similar to Nan Xiaonan and 24's experience. In fact, both of them were guests from another world. So you're actually also exploring the world's end? Luocio asked curiously as he thought of the ultimate goal of these individuals who had broken through the limits of various subworlds. The old man, the current Cain, gave a definite answer. While figuring out the old man's identity, the boss and the servant girl also followed his footsteps and went deep into the end of the cave, a mud hut that looked quite shabby. But before they arrived, there were already other people here. The descendants of the ancient race who lived in the past, a woman who looked like she was about to give birth, and her man. When the man and woman saw the return of the old man, they quickly came forward and thanked the old man. After expressing their gratitude, the man supported the pregnant woman and left. From the beginning to the end, they acted as if they didn't see any unfamiliar guests. In this past, I acted as a kind of person, a kind of guide. After the man and woman left, the old man smiled slightly and said, I taught them about childbirth, life and some small knowledge. Usually, if they encountered any difficulties, they would come to me. Luocio said with interest, like the role of the wise man in the village. I've just lived a little longer and seen a lot more things. The old man said rather casually, although the long river of time can't increase the original intelligence of an individual, or even if the increase is quite small, only knowledge can be accumulated endlessly. Aren't you curious about me? Luocio asked suddenly. After recognizing the servant girl's identity, the current Cain didn't ask about the other person, Luocio's inclination, which made Luocio more interested. The old man just smiled slightly and said, It's not the time to be curious. Right, I want to entertain the two of you, but I need you to completely understand the past here, otherwise, I think we can only talk. In fact, it was like a screen. Luocio and the servant girl were always in front of the screen, and the past was the content of the screen. Cain was the main body of the screen. The past here was actually a world in the consciousness of Cain. Because it was fictional, it was completely different from the life in the pit of corpses described in the Animal Skin Diary. The path of the escapees from the farm, who lived in the pit of corpses, was also completely different from the life in the screen. Luocio didn't hesitate at all. After lifting the servant girl's hand, he slowly took a step forward. This step was like breaking through a layer of invisible membrane, and he and the servant girl entered the world of the screen. There was no change at all. But in this past, he and the servant girl already existed. As if feeling this existence, the present Cain began to slowly boil water to brew tea in the mud hut. Try these. According to the memories of the original me that I inherited, these tea leaves came from a rare plant in a world that was almost covered by the sea. Of course, it doesn't exist, but this is only the world of consciousness. So if it's the taste, it should work. Just as Cain began to brew the tea, the servant girl flicked her finger slightly, and a black flame formed a few words in front of Boss Luo. Soul, power. Luocio immediately understood the hint from the servant girl. Power was the thing that the former Cain traded, and a soul was the thing that the former Cain gave. But Luocio didn't see Cain's name in the account books of the customers who hadn't arrived yet. As for the account books that recorded countless transactions, Boss Luo hadn't continued to look at them for a while. At most, he would just look up when necessary or randomly flip through a few pages when he remembered. Whether it was the former Cain or the club, the transaction between them had been completed. When the former Cain accidentally fell into this subworld and died, his soul had been automatically entered into the account book through the contract. This was probably before Luocio took over the club. As for the current Cain, it could be said that the current Cain and the Cain that had completed the transaction were two different entities of consciousness. Even though the current Cain had the name of Cain and even inherited a lot of Cain's memories, its essence was more like an incomplete copy. Or perhaps the former Cain created another form of continuation for himself that was about to dissipate. It had consciousness but didn't have a soul, yet it could think on its own. Luocio was more inclined to think of the present Cain as a program that had the same thinking pattern as the former Cain, part of his memories, and then carried out complicated calculations under these predetermined settings. Strictly speaking, the present Cain was just a fake. He couldn't help but think of the soul engineering that was born in a destroyed subworld that Miss Maid had mentioned before. After tasting the tea from another subworld, Luocio glanced at the little vengeful spirit hiding behind Cain. The little vengeful spirit was now looking at each other timidly. Boss Luo smiled faintly. By the way, old mister, you just said that there seems to be some difference between you and the Lost Fong. You can't control the Lost Fong now, right? The present Cain was silent for a while. He seemed to be thinking and deciding whether to disclose his own information. He muttered to himself, "According to the memories I inherited, even if it doesn't mean anything, you seem to have the ability to know everything. It's not advisable to hide it." In this way, Luo Qiu felt that the current arcane was just a program with the thinking patterns, memories, and even emotions of the previous arcane. The feeling was getting stronger and stronger. Finally, the old man nodded and said slowly, "The Lost Fang was a name given by the vampires that lived on this world. In fact, it's just a body that didn't rot after the death of the original Cain. Strictly speaking, although I inherited the name O'Kane, I'm actually more like its descendant. Originally, I also had the control over the Lost Fang. But after some time, the part that I can control has begun to weaken." Luoqiu thought for a while and said, "Because of the 13 clans that lived on this body?" The old man nodded. "As I said, there are some legends about Cain in this world. In fact, there are many legends about Cain. He's not necessarily the ancestor that the 13 clans in this world think. The original Cain was actually more willing to admit that he was the first child of Adam and Eve, the sinner that he exiled and couldn't be killed by others." He shook his head, seemingly unwilling to mention this part. "Because Cain in this world has always been a vampire, when the original Cain's existence was embedded in Cain, its body automatically underwent some changes due to the rules of the world's will. In other words, it became a form of expression that was in line with the history of this world. Generally speaking, we call this transformation the world's instability." He nodded. "It's just something that some people from different worlds met on the way of exploration and researched in their spare time. At first, it was proposed by a guy named Archimedes. And then it gradually spread. I heard that he later joined a large-scale exploration group called Transcendence, right?" Shaking his head, the old man said indifferently, "In fact, the original Cain didn't really meet him. Although the original Cain also received an invitation from this group, he didn't join in the end. In fact, from my point of view, maybe the original Cain should join a group because maybe this way, when the original Cain encounters that great horror, he won't be in danger of dying. In contrast, you might not appear," Luoqiu said softly. "If he exists, you won't exist. Are you willing?" The old man said indifferently, "I heard that you are very good at making others fall into difficult choices. It seems to be true." "I'm sorry, I'll be careful," Luoqiu said apologetically. The current Cain shook his head and didn't mind. Instead, he continued the previous topic. "Among the 13 clans, there's a ritual called sacred blood. Through this ritual, they want to awaken the consciousness of the Lost Fang. Because they believe that the ancestor isn't dead, but just asleep. Because the Lost Fang is alive, at least its body is still alive." "They succeeded," Luoqiu said coldly. The old man sighed. "You can say that. For many years, the endless blood that was injected into the Lost Fang through the sacred blood as consciousness contained too many distracting thoughts. These distracting thoughts included the desires and hopes of the vampires from the 13 clans, as well as the hatred and despair of being sacrificed. In the end, all the distracting thoughts merged into a new consciousness. Not only does it share the original self as remnant like me, but because it was created by the original vampires of this world, it is even more in line with the Wokane's form in the legends of this world. Counting the time, the next sacred blood ritual of the 13 clans is about to arrive, right? To be honest, if this ritual happens a few more times, maybe I'll be devoured by it. After all, compared to me, it's closer to the unstable state of this world. Another newborn body of consciousness." The old man smiled bitterly. "It's asleep. It's also because it's asleep that I can slightly control the current, Lost Fang's body. It's probably because it's too close to the legends of this world. Like the vampires, it likes to sleep. Through sleeping, it can integrate the distracting thoughts in its body and make itself purer. Basically, as long as I don't show any signs of fighting with it for the lost Fong, and just move my body a little, it won't care about me. After all, compared to it, I'm too weak. Do you plan to continue like this until it becomes stronger and then devour you? Boss Luo smiled and asked softly. Kane smiled bitterly. I didn't pay attention at all. You still gave me the choice. Chapter 1349. He remained silent after hearing Boss Luo's question. Luoqiu wasn't in a hurry. Basically, he would be patient with every choice he made. The waiting process wasn't long. You, all of you, what help can you give me? Kane asked slowly. What do you want? Luoqiu asked softly. He fell into deep thought again. He was like a statue that had existed since ancient times. He didn't move, not even the slightest expression on his face. The existence of the past also slowed down. Everything in front of him seemed to degenerate from high resolution to low resolution, and then became blurry and rough. Only the small, vengeful spirit didn't change. Luoqiu knew that the pit of corpses outside the cave was also in the same situation. Other than the vengeful spirits of the mutated children who died, everything here was the result of a calculation in Kane's mind. When it focused most of its attention on thinking about a certain problem, it naturally couldn't take into account the natural changes of the past. After a long time, Kane seemed to be alive all of a sudden. He raised his eyeless face and faced Luoqiu. His sunken eye sockets were like black holes, but Luoqiu could see that in the depths of these black holes, there was something that wanted to emit light. It was like a spark that lacked oxygen. Actually, all these years, I've been thinking about why the original self wanted me to be born. Kane pressed his hands lightly on the table. Through this touch, the blurry surroundings gradually became clear again. I think, maybe it wants me to inherit its legacy. Kane paused for a moment, as if he was trying to think of a more reasonable word to use. Perhaps, from the memories I inherited, there was a hidden command. It wants me to complete what it hasn't done yet. Explore? Luoqiu nodded. Kane nodded, then pointed at his head and said, Most of the knowledge I have stored here is related to this. Apart from that, there isn't much else. In fact, if it hadn't left behind the name O'Kane for me, perhaps even if I was born, I wouldn't have known who I was. In fact, who am I now? I've always wondered. Kane shook his head. This doubt has always made me want to avoid the commands contained within the knowledge in my mind. Then, a new question appeared in my mind. What am I? So, you never left this place. Luoqiu smiled and said, You chose to stay where you are, you chose to stop. Stop, huh? Kane muttered to himself for a moment before nodding his head. Perhaps you should say that I've been born with cowardice, but I like your choice of words. So, to be more precise, I should be hesitating to move forward. Luoqiu said indifferently, We stop, or even stay where we are, most of the time, just to wait for a better opportunity. Even if we miss it because of hesitation. Kane smiled. You don't seem like a guy with mysterious power, but more like a person. Luoqiu said, Didn't the old mister say that what's accumulated over time is knowledge, not wisdom? Even if knowledge makes one wise, there isn't much of a difference. Seniors seem to be full of wisdom, but there are more seniors who are still ignorant. No one says that those who live for a long time will become smarter than others, and can do what others can't. That's actually a projection of the person's own wishes. Then, there isn't much of a difference whether one has power or not. Of course, this is only my current opinion. You will be refuted. Kane smiled. No matter if it's those who already have knowledge, or those who wish to become such people. Breaking a beautiful assumption is the same as stabbing the other party in the back. Then let's not argue. Luoqiu smiled and said, Besides, maybe in the future, I will overturn this current opinion. Just like how the young me feels that the young me is childish, the mature me will feel that the young me is ignorant. If I really feel ashamed, I don't think I'm any different from the average person. I would probably deny all of this. Cain didn't say anything and only lowered his head. Unknowingly, the little wraith had already laid on his lap and seemed to have fallen asleep. He reached out his hand and gently stroked the little wraith's back. Then he raised his head again and said, "If possible, I don't want to inherit all these. I don't want to disappear like this. In fact, I don't have a strong desire to explore the origin. Even if I do, it's probably instilled in me by it. In fact, compared to this kind of illusory exploration, compared to fighting for control of the lost Fong with another newborn Canis consciousness, I prefer my current life. I once fell into a long period of confusion, and the constant thinking and contradictions made me unstable. It was also during that period of time that the other Canis consciousness had room to grow. In fact, when it was first born, I was fully capable of destroying it. Why didn't you do that? Give up on myself?" Cain smiled bitterly. "Perhaps I felt that it was more in line with the expectations of the original self. For example, if my parents gave birth to two brothers, one smart and the other stupid, I think I would be the latter, the one who wasn't expected by my parents, and the one who would only bring trouble. Naturally, I would have the feeling that perhaps without the stupid one, the family would become more perfect." "Do you think this is actually an illusion?" Luocio asked curiously. "Perhaps in the future, if there is a future." Cain used Boss Luo's words to reply. Luocio smiled and said formally, "Your wish." Cain rubbed the little vengeful spirit's head and said softly, "I don't know if they will grow up one day." "Only here?" Cain opened his mouth and smiled bitterly. He said self-deprecatingly, "It seems that I don't have much purchasing power. But, thank you for not turning a blind eye to my poverty. In fact, I think I really don't have anything to trade. I'm just a fake. According to the knowledge I inherited, I don't seem to have much value." Boss Luo didn't say anything. He just waved his hand and a sheepskin scroll appeared, a blank sheepskin scroll. After that, lines of words began to appear on it. But the words didn't appear very quickly, as if it was writing and stopping. Yu Yi knew that this was her master drafting the contents of the contract. Normally, the contents of the contract would be automatically generated after both parties discussed. The altar would give the most accurate regulations. It wasn't forbidden for the boss to draft the contents of the contract. But, when the transaction volume reached a certain level, it would naturally be more efficient and save more time. Miss Maid's current owner was still okay. He didn't immerse himself in a huge amount of transactions. If it was the previous owner wouldn't even have time to be absent-minded due to the amount of work involved in drafting the contract. "Old mister, this is the contents of the contract. If you don't have any problems, do you have any dissatisfactions?" Finally, the words on the sheepskin scroll completely stopped appearing. Luocio placed it in front of Cain. Cain had lost his eyes, but when his hand touched the sheepskin scroll, his consciousness had already imprinted the contents of the contract. After a long time, Cain slowly sighed. "I think, for me, it's enough of a privilege. If there really is such a day, I don't mind." As he spoke, he directly imprinted his palm at the bottom of the sheepskin scroll. Then, the sheepskin scroll spontaneously combusted and disappeared into the air. "Then, please wait for a moment." Luocio stood up and nodded at Cain with a smile. Then, he left this past with Miss Maid. When they returned to the present, they were still in the residence of the Red Dragon skeleton. Miss Maria was still lying on the ground. Actually, not much time had passed, probably only a moment. The little vengeful spirit was gone. It had returned to its past. Boss Luo waved his hand so that Miss Witch wouldn't lie on the ground. Then, he walked out of the residence of the Red Dragon skeleton with Miss Maid. The ceiling was covered with vines and fibrous roots like mud, completely submerging the entire corpse pit, leaving only a small space in the residence. Luocio looked around and finally fixed his eyes on a direction. After that, Miss Maid sensed something. He raised his hand and waved out black flames. The fire crows were like two black phoenixes, instantly burning out two long passages in the sea of vines and fibrous roots. Not long after, something rolled out from the passage. They were the golden dragon, Busby, who called himself Norman, and the young girl Mina. There were many small wounds on their bodies. One could vaguely see the blood flowing out from these wounds. Of course, they had different physiques. The golden dragon's wounds healed almost instantly, while a Norman's recovery was slower. The young girl's wounds didn't change much. But they were all fine. But at this time, the surrounding vines, or rather, the entire corpse pit began to shake. Above, the intertwined vines and fibrous roots began to wriggle and twist. They were like lines. Finally, a huge face became three-dimensional from a flat surface, protruding from the top. It was angry. Roar. Countless vines became sharp at this moment. Thousands of them directly pierced down from this huge face. Luocio just looked at the huge angry face with a calm face. Miss Maid just grabbed a ball of black flame when these sharp thorns came, and threw it out. The black flame that could ignite anything directly burned the moment it touched these thorns, and then it shot up. The huge face above was outlined by the black flame more vividly. As a last resort, the huge face had to directly fall off the burning places. A large amount of ashes fell from above, like black snow. At the same time, its angry roar became more and more terrifying. It seems that although this guy was born from a lost Fong, it didn't inherit much of Cain's knowledge. Or, the one in the cave still has some reservations. Luocio nodded, looking indifferent. At this moment, he raised his head and looked at the huge face. He said indifferently, "I'm very sorry, we didn't mean to disturb you while you were eating. It's just that it might be faster to call you out like this. We were just asked by someone to discuss something with you. Basically, another you wants to get out of this body, and at the same time, you promise that you won't have any thoughts of harming or devouring it." There was no response. The huge face just roared again, and then it released more sharp thorns from the huge face. At the same time, blood-sucking vines that looked like long worms drilled out from the ground. It was like a group of demons dancing wildly. Luocio shook his head and looked at Miss Maid. "It seems that we need to let it calm down to have a better discussion. How long will it take?" Miss Maid smiled sweetly and said, "Be violent, it should be fast. Please give me 10 seconds, my master." "If it's over," Luocio joked, "let me help you take care of your body tonight? Of course, if it's not over, I'll let you dress up again, how about it?" "Yeah." Miss Maid chuckled, "It's really a troublesome choice." With that, Yi took out a pocket watch. She opened the cover and put it in her master's hand, and then said softly, "Then, let's start from this second." The second hand began to move to the first square. Miss Maid didn't move, just looked at her master's eyes. Until the second hand moved to the third square, Miss Maid slowly stepped back. The fourth square, 1 step. The fifth square, 2 steps. The sixth square, turn around. The seventh square, a black flag appeared in Miss Maid's hand. The eighth square, Miss Maid raised the black flag in her hand, and black fire lotuses bloomed around. All the vines in the whole corpse pit were instantly calcined into ashes, like black snow sprinkling down. The ninth square, a figure fell from the ashes. His body was still burned by the black flame. The 10th square. Miss Maid turned around, and the black flag was held behind her back. She bent forward slightly and said softly, "If you want to take care of it, why don't you wait until tomorrow?" ######PS. This title will only use 2 chapters. Really? Chapter 1350. In order to make the result of the bet more ceremonial, Boss Luo made a card and handed it to her after the servant girl put away her battle flag. It was made of the same material as a black card, but there was no mark of the club on it. Instead, there was only Luocio's surname, a simple word, Luo. "What's this?" Miss Maid was obviously surprised. Boss Luo smiled and said, "Your reward. You can exchange it with coupons. No matter when, no matter where, when I burn it, I'll fulfill my promise to you." She directly put away the Luo card and whispered, "Then, I'm even more reluctant to use it. I really want to collect a lot of these cards and string them together like a necklace made of shells." Luoqiu smiled. The ceremony was completed, and the next thing was to deal with the business. Now, all the vines in the deep pit of corpses had been removed. Of course, for the lost fangs that grew all over the 13 clans' territory in the inhuman territory. The amount of vines in the deep pit of corpses under the crack of the Torido clan was obviously not enough to hurt the lost fangs. Boss Luo and Miss Maid walked side by side to the figure that fell from the black flame. It had completely turned into charcoal. At least, that was what it looked like from the outside. But soon, this piece of charcoal suddenly cracked open. A bare-chested young man, who did not look handsome but was quite pleasing to the eye, slowly stood up from the charred object like a moth breaking out of its cocoon. This man had a 60% to 70% resemblance to the reborn consciousness of Gui Kane in the past cave. The only difference was that the one in front of him was obviously young and upright. A chaotic aura slowly spread out. Luoqiu saw a lot of different lights in this man's eyes. His pupils were like bubbles that were constantly condensing and then bursting. It was extremely complicated, like a kaleidoscope. However, it was clear that his rampage had been suppressed. The one in the cave had said that the consciousness of the other Kane was an amalgamation of the prayers, hopes, and the resentment of the sacrifices of the 13 clans over the years. It was a bit like the dragon's calamity that appeared during the Mount Tai incident. Usually, it was more in a deep sleep. Through deep sleep, it purified the messy consciousness. Because it contained too many materials, the consciousness born from the sacred blood ritual of the 13 ancient clans was like a person with many personalities, and these personalities were awake all the time. Of course, only the instinct of the vampires was common. Probably only when it was eating it, or they would become quieter. Still, it was quieter now, probably because it felt the threat of death. Hence, the chaotic and not completely unified consciousness would come to an unprecedented tacit understanding in the face of such great danger. "Who are you?" After he became quiet, his voice was like a combination of many voices, from male to female. Luoqiu smiled and said, "Seems like we can talk more smoothly now. Do you still remember what I said before?" The man frowned, his eyes were filled with fear. At the same time, he frowned and said, You were hired by that guy to deal with me? Actually, I don't plan to do that." Luoqiu shook his head. You have more power over the Lost Fang than it, and it just wants to get away from all of this. In fact, maybe you can see two parallel lines. The man sneered. "That guy has more knowledge about Kane than I do. If I let it out of my sight, once it wants to deal with me, I will be very passive. Also, when it says it wants to get away from all of this, do you believe it?" Luoqiu looked sideways and said, "Suspicious personality, which branch of the 13 clans did it come from?" "Norfeller," the man said subconsciously, then suddenly became frightened. Why did he give such a simple answer? "Norfeller." Luoqiu nodded, then snapped his fingers and said with a smile, "How about now, do you feel better now?" The man. This new consciousness born from the sacred blood ritual of the 13 clans suddenly widened its eyes and didn't know what to do. Voice. In its consciousness there were a lot of different voices, different wills, different thoughts, even different personalities. They were like a pot of the best ingredients, but all of them were put together to stew. In the end, they formed a nest of colorful, poisonous mushroom-like things. But at this moment it could feel that one of the main voices in its consciousness disappeared, and an unprecedented feeling of comfort made it stunned on the spot. What did you do to me?" Luoqiu said. "I just temporarily blocked some of the voices that made you uncomfortable. That was also my suggestion. We were asked to come here by someone else. Now, if you agree, we will help you to unify those discordant parts in your consciousness. This is a trade, what do you think? The man was silent, then it showed a hesitant expression. In the end, when all kinds of different voices began to sound in its head again, it had no choice but to hold its head in pain, like a madman, and revealed a ferocious expression. You were born because of the legend of Cain in this world. Luacio's voice became more and more ethereal. The voice penetrated the countless chaotic wills in its consciousness, and directly reached the source of its thoughts. In my view, you are a unique individual. You don't need to inherit too much of Cain's original memories. You also don't want to become the next Cain. Perhaps you can't completely accept the memories from Cain, and in the end it will cover your present and become a strange you. Will you be able to see it? It clenched its teeth as if it was going to break them, and its eyes turned blood red. Luacio continued, even if you don't have more of Cain's knowledge and memories, the fact that you will completely control Lost Fong will not change. Do you still want to hesitate? She's lying to you, don't believe her. Tear her apart. Suck her blood dry. You will become even more powerful. You can consider agreeing to her first. Agree to her and then betray her. I've fallen in love with her. How can there be such a perfect woman? The one beside her is also perfect. I want to have them. How can I blaspheme this beauty? They should be protected and protected. Blood, blood, blood. Too beautiful. Is this the feeling of being moved? You must devour that guy. Then you will be complete. You will become a true ancestor. Stop talking. Finally, after a loud roar, it seemed to have collapsed, and its entire body seemed to be dispirited and listless. It panted and bowed, but then slowly raised its head and said with difficulty, I agree to your conditions. As long as you can solve my problem, I can guarantee that from today onwards, I will never have any ideas about that guy again. Luacio opened his hands slightly and smiled. That's great, I prefer this kind of method of solving problems through negotiation. A sheepskin scroll was slowly opened in front of it, and Boss Luo said slowly with his usual voice, Agreement Nyerong, we will help you solve the problem of consciousness disharmony and unify your consciousness. But at the same time, you need to promise that you will never trouble another consciousness. You can have thoughts of hurting or devouring it, but you can't put it into action. I agree. It just quickly glanced at the sheepskin scroll. Immediately. Make them stop. Make them disappear. Please don't rush. Luacio smiled slightly. Since you have understood the content, then the next is the punishment. This agreement is between both parties. At the same time, there is another restriction. You can't really hurt it. And it is the same, after successfully escaping, it can have thoughts of revenge, but it can't do it. Once one of you violates this principle, the punishment will be. You will be in a worse state than before. Think carefully, the binding force of this agreement is something you can't resist. Once you sign it, you can't violate it. I will give you time to consider. How long do you want? It just wanted to stop the pain that had been tormenting it since it was born. Consider? Consider. It stared at the words on the sheepskin scroll. It didn't know any of these words, but it knew the meaning of each word. No need to consider. I agree. It directly pressed its palm on the sheepskin scroll. It almost didn't hesitate. The sheepskin scroll with the mark started to burn and then disappeared. But it was still in great pain and didn't change anything. Because of this, its original rationality was almost completely destroyed. It doesn't work at all. You are lying to me. You are looking for death. Ah! Its eyes were completely crazy. It saw those vines that had been burned to ashes, at this moment, were crazily growing out from the ground again. The vines were dancing like a group of demons. But at the moment when these things were most active, its roar suddenly stopped. The whole world seemed to be quiet in an instant. It was still holding its head, but its face suddenly became blank. It opened its mouth slightly. Little by little, it let go of its hands, feeling that the world had never been so quiet. It was so quiet that it seemed to hear a ringing sound in its ears. It was too quiet. It had never been so quiet. In its consciousness, there was only one thought now. A thought that was completely its own. It no longer felt the endless desire of the 13 clans in the blood, nor could it hear the call and worship from the blood. It slowly covered its face with its hands, its lips trembled, and suddenly knelt on the ground. It felt that the world had never been so beautiful. "How do you feel?" Luochu asked in a low voice. "Great," it said subconsciously, "unprecedentedly good." As it spoke, it stood up little by little. After it no longer had that violent feeling, it looked a little different. "How can I thank you for this? What should I do to express my joy to you at this moment?" "Just abide by the agreement," Luochu said with a smile. "Of course." It nodded. "How can I not abide by it? It really makes me so good. Look." At this time, the pit of corpses suddenly shook violently, and then a huge crack broke out from it. Then, a huge black shadow slowly stretched out from the crack. It was a huge palm. It was even bigger than the golden dragon when it unfolded its body. "It can already move its body freely?" Luochu looked up and glanced at it. "Maybe what it said is true. Compared to it, a lost Fang seems to accept you more. It's just that it can't coordinate all the wills in its consciousness, so it can't move every part of its body well. But now..." It smiled slightly and opened its hands. The ground shook even more violently. "Look, this is a power that can break the limit of the world, and even be able to travel freely in space and time. Immortal and indestructible. Although, all these years, the 13 clans have only recovered a very small part of its vitality through the sacred blood ceremony. But I think, as long as there is enough blood of powerful creatures, one day, it will be as strong as before." Luochu said casually. What Duquesne wanted to do in the past was to explore the end of the origin. If its power can be restored to its original level, it should be smoother. "Then, I wish you success." It suddenly said at this time, "Wish you success? No, no. Why don't you become a part of me? When I reach the end, all of you share the incomparable joy with me." As it said, it suddenly stretched out its hand. And the huge palm that stretched out from the ground was doing the same at this time. The palm was too big. Even though it was moving at a very fast speed, it still seemed to be quite slow. Pressing down. Seeing this, Miss Maid was expressionless. She waved her hand, and a black flaming phoenix flew directly to the huge palm that was slowly slapping down. But this palm was too big. The black flaming phoenix was extinguished directly under the huge palm like an ant. Miss Maid frowned slightly. "A pseudo-eternal indestructible body? It's the first time for me to encounter it directly. It's something that Cain once bought." After that, the battle flag appeared in Miss Maid's hand again. At the same time, the black and white maid costume turned into a tight light armor after the black flames flowed through it. She looked back directly at this time and said quickly, "It's still a little difficult for me to wear the work uniform." Actually, the work uniform looked better. Luochu didn't say anything, but he suddenly thought of one thing. The club's transactions always required the use of force. Some commissions would be more efficient if they were directly solved by force. Because of the existence of such transactions, the Black Soul Envoys kept improving their abilities. Otherwise, the Black Soul Envoys only needed to learn to attract customers more skillfully. As a shop owner, he often needed to use his lifespan to deduct. At this time, it was the best choice to let the Black Soul Envoys do it for him. Therefore, Miss Maid chose to do it directly at this time based on the club's principle. All the staff would do things other than the transaction content. Having said that, Luochu grabbed her wrist from behind. "Master, this is my duty." Miss Maid shook her head. Luochu suddenly pulled Miss Maid directly into his arms. "The former one may be. But it's no longer the case for me. And I didn't intend to do it myself from the beginning. Miss Maid was still feeling the warmth in his arms, but the huge palm didn't stop, it even threatened the top. He didn't intend to do it himself? She was slightly stunned at the same time. At this moment, the speed at which the gigantic palm was descending seemed to slow down a lot. In the dark blue world, the surrounding rock walls and the soil, a large number of vines extended out and directly wrapped around the gigantic palm, firmly pulling it to a stop. In front of them, above them, an old figure appeared in front of Boss Luo and Miss Maid. It was the old man in the cave in the past, the first reborn consciousness of Lost Fang. It actually chose to protect us. Miss Maid couldn't help being surprised. It was reasonable to say that as it inherited most of Cain's knowledge and memory, it should be very clear about the shop's ability. It's not to protect us. Luoqiu shook his head. It only wants to protect the things buried in this deep pit. The skeletons of those children, Luoqiu suddenly asked at this time, do you really think that its birth is a continuation of Cain? Miss Maid frowned slightly. Luoqiu said softly, looking at the two bodies of consciousness that were born one after another, do you think it's similar, the original legend of Cain? The perpetrator and the victim. Cain and Abel. Miss Maid's heart moved. It is Abel. Luoqiu smiled. To be exact, it should be Abel, who was killed by itself in Cain's memory. It thinks that it's not real and thinks that it's fake, because it's never Cain. John 1:3-12. Unlike Cain, who belonged to the evil one and killed his brother. Why did he kill his brother? Because his own actions were evil and his brother's actions were good. Chapter 13:51. Strictly speaking, these two consciousnesses were born from the Lost Fang, and they both had control over the Lost Fang. The consciousness that was born from the sacred blood ritual of the 13 clans was obviously much stronger than the first consciousness that was born. Moreover, it had unified all the chaos in its consciousness and was no longer affected by the present. In terms of control over the Lost Fang, it was able to suppress the first consciousness in an instant. The vines that imprisoned the giant hand were broken in an instant, and the hand slammed down again. I was just thinking of dealing with you after I've dealt with these two fellows. The consciousness that was born from the sacred blood ritual, let's call it the sacred blood's consciousness. Its voice slowly sounded, speaking of which, I still have to thank you, because you brought me the opportunity to unify my consciousness. Otherwise, I don't know how many hundreds of years it would take for me to unify the chaos in my consciousness. Cain, who was barefoot and had the appearance of an old man who had lost both his eyes, regained his consciousness. At this time, he was using all his strength to resist the attack of the Holy Blood's will, as he said seriously, we have discussed countless times. I just want to escape the fate of Cain. You can take my body, I just want to escape. Just like before, as long as you agree, I can share all of Cain's knowledge with you. You don't have to be wary of me anymore. Because what I know, you will also know. We have coexisted for a long time, so you should be able to clearly understand my essence. The sacred blood's consciousness chuckled. I know you very well. But I don't believe in the former Cain. You were created by Cain in order to continue its existence. Perhaps even you yourself don't know if there's anything left behind by Cain in the depths of your soul. Even if there's only a 1 in a million chance, I don't want to see anything that could threaten me. The consciousness that was reborn sighed, stop. There are some things that you have never known. Because of this, you don't know what you are dealing with now. Even if it was the former Cain, it wouldn't fight it head-on even if it was at its peak. Ha 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 ha! Sacred Blood will suddenly laughed wildly. You don't even know how powerful I am after completely controlling the Lost Fang. This is the first time I felt it. When my will was unified, every inch of my flesh and blood contained a huge amount of power. this indestructible body. Even if the soul was annihilated, it could still remain intact and even preserve the vitality of the body. How powerful was it? The former Cain wasn't even worthy of using the lost Fang. Because of its weak will and soul, the lost Fang was unable to unleash its full power. But, taking a deep breath, the will of Saint Blood opened his hands. I'm different from him. I want to be even stronger. I'll use the power of the lost Fang to its limit. Once I devour you and grasp all of Cain's knowledge, I'll explore the primordial origin. When the time comes, even if I encounter the Void Azura, I won't fall in such a low-level world like Cain. Perhaps, the unification of the chaos wasn't a good thing for you. After all, it was the same as you unifying all the thoughts of the 13 clans. Those arrogant, narcissistic, cruel, or eccentric fellows. Have you forgotten how careful you were before you were united? Have you forgotten so quickly? Under the scouring of power, why have you swelled to such an extent? The reborn consciousness could not help but sigh. It's because you're useless. The will of Saint Blood sneered. You were born before me, but you didn't know the power of the lost Fang. But soon, you'll feel its beauty. You'll be with me. In these countless dimensions, only one Cain's continuation is enough. The giant palm had already landed in front of the reborn consciousness. However, it suddenly gave up resisting and stopped interfering with the control of the lost Fang, by the will of Saint Blood. In fact, it couldn't interfere too much at all. Even if it used all of its strength, it could only make the palm slightly stiffen for a moment. Perhaps everything will end perfectly like this. After I obtain all of Cain's knowledge and memories, I'll leave this world. This thought flashed through the will of Saint Blood's mind. As for its creator, the 13 clans, before it left, it would devour all of their power as a reward. Selfishness and heartlessness. This also originated from the creators of the 13 clans. You shouldn't go against your creators and even try to kill them. You must learn to be grateful. All of a sudden, a thunderous voice rang out in the consciousness of the will of the Saint Blood. This voice shook the sea of consciousness of the will of the Saint Blood to the point where it began to churn. Well done. You must eat those fellows. Because I'm their ancestor. For the sake of their ancestor, this is what the descendants should do. Suck them dry. Suck them dry. Another enormous sound rang out. After that, a third, a fourth, and a seemingly endless sound surged in the sea of its consciousness, setting off enormous waves that overflowed to the heavens. In just an instant, in one of the 60 instants in the time it took to snap a finger, its entire sea of consciousness was on the verge of collapse. Gah! A sharp and painful cry rang through the entire lost rift. At this moment, while the will of the Saint Blood was crying in pain, the palm of the lost Fang seemed to have rusted. It still continued to slap down, but it slowly stopped. It was as if a certain gear that was connected to the arm was rusted and couldn't fit together. The arm finally stopped moving. At this moment, the young man's face that was projected by the will of the Holy Blood began to wildly change. It covered its ears, and it couldn't even say a complete sentence. Only that painful roar could be heard. The projection of the will of a Saint Blood was distorted. Like a melted candle, its whole body was flowing to different degrees. It clutched its face tightly, and one of its eyeballs bulged out as if it was about to explode. If any of you were to violate this principle, then the punishment would be a worse state than before. This was what Boss Luo said before it agreed to the agreement. You set me up. Luochio didn't speak, and his face was expressionless. He had given it time to think, and he had repeatedly reminded it that this wasn't his habit when dealing with customers. You set me up. I won't let you leave here. You'll be buried here together. With all the stubbornness of the 13 ancient families, it naturally had the craziest side. Therefore, the will of the Saint Blood roared at the end, and the lost Fang, which had stopped moving, started to move again. But this time, when he activated it again, the huge palm began to break apart in an instant. First, the muscles of the palm, then the fingers. Pieces of the palm that were like huge rocks fell down crazily. Under the impact of the huge fragments, the deep pit of corpses not only raised clouds of dust, but also shook crazily like an earthquake. Boom! When a piece of the palm fell on Luacio's head, it was blocked by something before it could touch his body, and then it turned into ashes. The palm that was much wider than the whole deep pit of corpses was now only as thick as a normal person's arm bone, and it extended all the way to the crack that appeared on it. The will of the Saint Blood was now like a pile of mud, and it seemed to be desperately trying to integrate itself. The mud-like body projection and the two blood-red eyes stared at Sui Xiong at the same time. In the end, when this thin and long arm finally fell in front of Luocio, it was unknown whether it was blocked by Boss Luo's own defense, or because it couldn't withstand such a ridiculous amount of damage, but this thin arm finally cracked into pieces. Seeing this, the will of the Saint Blood stopped being crazy, and the mud-like body projection suddenly turned into a ball of irregular light. Like cells under a microscope, it escaped from the crack that extended from the palm. At this time, the reborn consciousness moved. It blocked the escape route of the will of the Saint Blood, reached out its hand and grabbed this ball of light. The will of the Holy Blood struggled crazily in the palm of the reborn consciousness. Fission, fission, fusion, fission, fusion. In the end, it stopped all fission and fusion, turning into a black sphere that looked like a rough ceramic embryo. The reborn consciousness held this ball with both hands and slowly exhaled. Is it over? It didn't remember how long it had been entangled with the will of the Saint Blood. It had been too long, and it couldn't be counted in detail. It thought that this entanglement would end with its defeat. In the silence, it could feel that someone was approaching. Boss Luo and Miss Maid were approaching. When Boss Luo and Miss Maid finally arrived, the reborn consciousness slowly asked, "What are you going to do with it?" It slightly lifted the ball in its hand. Luocio just glanced at it and said casually, "Why should I deal with it? It doesn't belong to me." The reborn consciousness opened its mouth slightly, and after a short moment of silence it slowly said, "It's in a very bad state now. The various consciousnesses that were already beginning to unify have been scattered again. Perhaps it will take a long time before a new consciousness is born. Are you going to wait for the next one to appear?" The reborn consciousness shook its head, and then nodded. "I want to try. If I teach it from the beginning, it will be very hard." Luocio smiled. The reborn consciousness said seriously, originally, most of its craziness was because the continuous Saint Blood ceremony brought too many expectations from the 13 families. "I won't let the Saint Blood ceremony continue. Maybe it will work. Even if you're not sure, you still want to give it a try?" Luocio looked at its dark eyes. "Why don't you try?" The reborn consciousness didn't understand and asked back, "No matter what, it is the same as me. We were both born from the lost Fang. For me, it is equivalent to my brother. I should have shown the greatest kindness to my own brother." "You are right." Boss Luo smiled slightly. At this moment, the reborn consciousness suddenly faced the deep pit of the corpse. At the crack on the palm, it didn't move for a long time. A slight vibration began to spread slowly. This kind of tremor wasn't strong, but it spread over a huge area. At this moment, in the inhuman territory, all the territories of the 13 clans that were connected by the lost rift could feel this slight tremor. The vampires in the 13 families in their territories didn't know what happened. Only the 13 Grand Dukes who were preparing for the Saint Blood ceremony woke up almost at the same time. Then, the vampires in the 13 families could feel the anger from the Grand Dukes in their territories. It was a very strange thing, like some kind of crystal, but also like a liquid like mercury, slightly viscous and hardened mercury. It was about the size of a millstone. It slowly rose from the crack in the corpse pit and finally came to the side of the reborn consciousness. This is the lost Fong. The reborn consciousness said slowly to the boss and Miss Maid. Of course, you should know what it is better than me. After all, this is what Cain bought from you. The pseudo-eternal indestructible body. The information about this part naturally appeared in Luocchio's mind. He looked at the pseudo-eternal indestructible eye and then said calmly, "Now you can control it more freely. Congratulations." Unexpectedly, the reborn consciousness shook its head. "I don't plan to use it, and I don't even plan to hold it. After all, it is still Cain's thing. It will call to me no matter how far away I am from it, and this will only make me remember that I am still the continuation of Cain. So, I will never know the answer to who I am. So." The reborn consciousness waved its hand and slowly pushed the pseudo-eternal indestructible body to the front of Luocchio. "I plan to return it to you, and because it is in your hands, my connection with it will be completely cut off. Then, I think, maybe it will make it easier for me to find the answer." Luocchio opened his mouth slightly and pondered for a moment before saying, "You have to know that Cain bought it from us at the cost of his soul. Now, because of his death, Cain's soul has been automatically recovered. In fact, because of the pseudo-eternal indestructible body, during the long exploration journey, Cain's soul has become far more powerful than before, and its value is even more immeasurable. Now, if you return the pseudo-eternal indestructible body, even I feel like I have taken advantage of it. Then, the reborn consciousness said slowly, "I will use it to buy something." Chapter 1352. There was indeed an inseparable connection between the pseudo-eternal indestructible body and the reborn consciousness. No matter how long the distance was or how much time had passed, this connection would not change. But when the pseudo-eternal indestructible body approached Luocchio, the connection between them had begun to weaken and it continued to weaken. In just a moment, this solid connection seemed to have become a thin thread, which could be broken with a gentle pull. "It seems that my judgment is right." The reborn consciousness had obviously noticed this change. "I want to get rid of it, but at the same time, I don't want it to fall into someone's hands. Only in your hands it's the safest." It probably relied on the power behind the club to isolate everything and ignore all prying, a powerful barrier. So, Luocchio soon understood what the reborn consciousness wanted to buy from him. "You want us to keep the pseudo-eternal indestructible body?" The reborn consciousness nodded and said calmly, "That's right. Only when it's in your hands will it be in the safest state, and the cost of keeping it is the body itself. As for the duration of keeping it, it's the day I die. Of course, if I need to use it during the process, I can take it out from your hands." Escrow service. Luocchio nodded. He had no objection to this kind of business, so he basically agreed without thinking. But before he agreed, Luocchio looked at the reborn consciousness and said, "Please think carefully about the value of the pseudo-eternal indestructible body, because you can't predict how long you have before you die." According to the reborn consciousness, even if it died tomorrow, or even half an hour later, the pseudo-eternal indestructible body would still enter the club's account and become the club's property. Of course, it originally came from the club and was sold by the previous owner. No need. The reborn consciousness shook its head. In fact, the sooner the decision is made, the better. More consideration will only waste more time. Then, let's sign the contract again. Luocchio didn't talk much nonsense. Although it was the first time he encountered such an escrow service, it didn't arouse his interest. At this moment, the reborn consciousness quite straightforwardly stamped its own mark on a new contract. When this contract took effect and then burned away, the transaction was already in a continuous state of effect. The pseudo-eternal indestructible body fell into Boss Luo's hands, and it began to shrink again little by little. It was originally the size of a millstone, but it didn't take long for it to shrink to the size of a rhombus crystal. The crystal gave out a colorful brilliance, but it was not hard, instead, it was very soft. With a gentle pinch, it could change its original rhombus shape. I didn't expect it to shrink again. Although the reborn consciousness couldn't see things, it had the ability to know what was happening around it. I thought its original appearance. At this time, Boss Luo said, intentionally or unintentionally, strictly speaking, this is not a real pseudo-eternal indestructible body, of course. It's not a real pseudo-eternal indestructible body. It's not a natural pseudo-eternal indestructible body. But don't worry, even if it's not a natural pseudo-eternal indestructible body, it's no different from a real pseudo-eternal indestructible body. Speaking of which, this is the first time I know that this thing can be done to this extent. You? The reborn consciousness frowned. Boss Luo just smiled and didn't say anything more, and didn't intend to tell the reborn consciousness that this pseudo-eternal indestructible body was actually synthesized from a special material, and this special material was called myriad element. The pseudo-eternal indestructible body that Cain bought back then was formed from a complete myriad essence organ. Of course, due to the nature of the myriad essence substance, once it was fixed in a certain form, it couldn't be reversed. But even so, the reborn consciousness seemed to have put down a huge burden compared to the time in the cave in the past. The reborn consciousness was obviously more active now. Because it was an entity of consciousness, this kind of fluctuation of consciousness could be easily felt. Boss Luo handed the item to Miss Maid for safekeeping and muttered to himself for a while, then suddenly said, "Although the contract has been signed and the business relationship has been established, but even the reborn consciousness couldn't help but feel a little nervous at this time." Its knowledge of the club came from Cain's knowledge legacy, and in this legacy, many parts were about the mysteries of this shop, and before Cain encountered the fall of the Void Azura, he had made an extremely bold speculation. The shop might have been born in the original world, and the original Cain had once asked the shop about this question and even proposed to buy information. It was just that, regarding the contents of the shop owner's asking price was infinitely higher than a pseudo-eternal indestructible body. As for the price he received from the shop when he proposed to buy the primordial waymark, the former Cain felt a brief moment of despair. Even so, the former Cain didn't give up on the idea of exploring the primordial waymark. For transcendents, or rather, individuals who had reached such a level of evolution, as they explored the dimensions, they would clearly sense a very unique calling. And the first transcendents who explored the dimensions didn't know what that calling was. They only clearly knew the name of the source of the calling, the primordial waymark. Why did they explore the primordial waymark? Why did they reach the primordial waymark? Some had pondered over it for thousands or even tens of thousands of years, but they still couldn't find the answer, as if the impulse to explore came from the depths of the soul. But in truth, no one had ever reached the primordial waymark, and yet all the information about the distance was superfluous. Every transcendent who explored the dimensions had a different reaction to the calling from the primordial waymark in their consciousness, and everything they sensed was different. That was why there had never been a case where transcendents gathered and pieced together any clues from the information they received. That was why Cain would ask such questions and leave behind the answers he received. Such knowledge was constantly warning the reborn consciousness that in the endless river of time, only that shop couldn't be conquered through brute force. The shop wouldn't attack any individual, and in theory, every individual who came to the shop would become its customer. It didn't even have a stance. As long as the rules of the trade were not violated, no one would have a good ending if the rules were violated. If one were to say that 100 years ago in the modern realm, when the elites of Euroland all came out to attack the shop, it was a small game, then in the endless river of time and space, there were also transcendents who came to attack the shop. The knowledge passed down from Cain indicated that Cain wasn't the first to speculate that the shop had an unusual relationship with the primordial Waymark. A group of transcendents who became transcendents earlier than Cain had the same conjecture. A battle that covered the terrifying dimensions had occurred before Cain reached the level of transcendence, and there were no records of the final outcome. Even after exploring many dimensions, Cain could only guess from some clues. It was likely that the entire group of transcendents of the old generation had perished in battle. The dimensional crevice seemed to have formed after the Great War, as a battlefield of the Great War. And because of that, there was a period of stagnation in the exploration of dimensions for which no one knew how long, and all the transcendents of the old generation had disappeared without a trace. Until a certain point in time, a new generation of transcendents was born. It didn't have a name, but it was born naturally, and was at the level of a transcendent when it was born. Since its birth, it had never announced its name, and no transcendents of the new generation had truly seen it appear. It was unknown when it started, but legends about it began to circulate among the new generation of transcendents. It was said that the first transcendent of the new generation had left behind a name, and that there were about 3,000 others like it. It was just lucky that it was the first to awaken. It had very mysteriously used the word awaken. Therefore, apart from the seemingly innate desire to explore the primordial Waymark, searching for traces of the first transcendence of the new generation was another popular activity for many of the new generation of transcendents. Cain was considered a late addition to the new generation of transcendents. Most of the things he knew about the old generation were from the conversations of his seniors, or from his own exploration. But there was one thing that Cain was very clear about, and that was that after the war of the old generation, everyone had disappeared without a trace, but this shop still existed. Its power was indescribable. The reborn consciousness couldn't even think of a word to describe the nature of such an existence. Therefore, when he heard the word, but from Boss Luo, he couldn't help but feel nervous. But as for myself, I still feel that I owe it. After the reborn consciousness heard this sentence, he couldn't react for a while. Boss Luo just smiled faintly and said, "Actually, the main thing is that I like this past more." Although, at that moment, as Luocha was speaking, the entire pit of corpses began to undergo some strange changes. First, the place where the giant palm of the lost Fang appeared began to directly fill up. Then, just like in the inhuman domain, because the system that maintained the stability of the domain-S structure would suddenly change due to an error, the domain-S terrain would suddenly change. The whole pit of corpses had this kind of change in an instant. It was like a light that swept across from one side and then went to the other side like a barrier. The pit of corpses became the settlement that appeared in the past. They were made of bones, houses, and grayish-white paths. One could see the farmlands in the distance and the cave where the reborn consciousness lived. Although these are nothing to the pseudo-eternal indestructible body as the final transaction fee. But I think, a figure suddenly appeared on the street carved out of white bones. It was a young man with a basket on his back. After the first man appeared, the figures on the road, in the houses, in the fields, and in the plaza also began to become clear one after another. But I think, instead of letting this past exist only in the structure of your consciousness, it is better to let it have a more stable reality carrier. At first, the reborn consciousness could only feel all these changes, but gradually it seemed to see something. When the figures around it appeared one after another, when all the colors of this past could only exist in its consciousness and could not be seen with its own eyes, when everything was just colorless, color entered its sight just like that. The lost eyes were also restored in this change. The old appearance was also restored to its young appearance, almost the same appearance as the sacred blood's will. Then there was sound, the sound of them talking. Then there was singing. In the house, the woman was gently rocking the cradle, softly singing a lullaby. Then there was the baby. In the cradle, the the small figure began to fill up from being faint, from being almost transparent to gradually forming a shadow. Finally, it became complete. Of course, these are all calculated with the past in your consciousness as the basis. You don't need to continue to use a lot of energy to calculate these. I think this way you should be able to have more time to think about the questions you want to answer. The reborn consciousness just subconsciously touched its face. Fingers, it saw the shape of the fingers, and it touched its eyelid. Why do you have to do this? It opened its mouth, and the only feeling it could find was confusion. Boss Luo just smiled casually and said, "Didn't I say that this way, you don't need to spend too much energy to keep this past, for those small vengeful spirits. You can have more time to think about the answer to the question. Have you forgotten the content of the first contract between us?" The first contract. Before seizing the pseudo-eternal indestructible body, the first deal they made in the cave of the past was to completely free the reborn consciousness from the entanglement of the sacred blood-s will. Now, the content of this deal, as the sacred blood-s will returned to its initial scattered state, the shop had actually completed its product. Next, it needed the reborn consciousness to pay for it. When this commission was completed, the reborn consciousness would hand over its soul after it became a real object. So I think you don't need to thank me. I just did something that, if you see the essence clearly, might be annoying. Luoqiu smiled slightly. After all, I'm still a businessman. Oh right. In the end, Boss Luo waved his hand. In the deep pit of corpses, many skeletons suddenly emerged from the ground. They were scattered and shattered, but soon they separated again and then combined, finally becoming complete skeletons. They were human skeletons. In addition, there were also skeletons that were probably the skeletons of children. The skeletons of different sizes began to separate and then began to pair up. In the end, they were divided into many groups of 2s and 3s, and then they began to be embedded in different bone residences. These were the descendants of the ancients who had once lived here and escaped from the Wu farm. And because of their ignorance and nature, they had once given birth to children. Boss Luo said softly at this time, "Although I don't intend to find the souls of their parents after all, here, the parents already exist, and they didn't bury their faces with their own hands. But I think it's better for the family to be more complete." At this time, the reborn consciousness looked at the settlement in front of it, which it created to allow those lonely souls like ghosts to have a place in the past. Looking at those lively souls who had accompanied it for a period of time, and the scene of them shuttling here under the company of their parents, it couldn't even tell the difference between real and fake. In the end, Boss Luo suddenly asked, "Don't you plan to give this place a name?" It subconsciously said, "Enoch, this place will be called Enoch from now on." Chapter 1353. A large amount of gray fog started to appear in the surroundings. The fog was not loose. Instead, it was like a thick wall. When one put his hand into the fog, he could feel that the fog was stagnant. This place was named Enoch by the reborn consciousness. This was the last gift from Boss Luo. With the fog, Enoch, which was surrounded by the fog, was like a paradise or something similar. Of course, the pit of corpses was still huge. Enoch, which was surrounded by the fog, only took up about a quarter of the space. The pit of corpses outside the fog still looked the same as before. As for the lost rift that connected the 13 ancient clans' territories, it looked exactly the same as before. However, the lost Fong was now an item in the shop. The reborn consciousness still had the right to take out the lost Fong or the pseudo-eternal indestructible body from the shop. However, the possibility of the reborn consciousness using the lost Fong was not high. Outside the fog, in a pile of corpses. Suddenly, something came out of the pile of corpses. It should have violently broken the corpses that were on top of it. A loud bang was heard, followed by an angry roar. A golden dragon in a red suit stood on top of the white bones. It had regained some of its strength while it was unconscious, and at the same time, it remembered that it was in danger because of its lack of strength. The golden dragon felt that its dignity was greatly insulted. At this moment, some golden scales appeared on its cheeks, neck, and even arms. It opened its hands slightly with its palms facing up. 2 extremely red flames erupted from its palms. "I will definitely burn this place into purgatory," Fafnina roared angrily in her heart. Suddenly, she blinked her eyes. She was surprised to find something. For example, the vines seemed to have disappeared, and the surroundings returned to normal. Except for herself, there were gray corpses everywhere. The huge and exaggerated flames slowly dispersed. Fafnina put her palms on her eyebrows and looked around. "Beauty! Beauty! Beauty, where are you?" At this moment, there seemed to be movement coming from the bones not far away. The golden dragon was overjoyed and rushed over. At the same time, 2 figures broke out from the pile of bones. "Beautiful!" The golden dragon opened his mouth, but when he saw who it was, he realized that it was the vampire who called himself Norman and the ancient human girl, Mina. "Is that you?" Turned around and ran. The golden dragon's figure began to slowly fly above the pile of bones. It roared as it scanned its surroundings. Norman, Busby and the young girl, Mina, looked at each other and couldn't help but frown. "Brother, what happened just now?" Mina grabbed Busby's arm with lingering fear, her body trembling in fear. "It should be fine now," Busby comforted her in a low voice. Then, he lifted the cloak on his back and pulled the girl into his arms, using the cloak to shield her. "I will protect you. Because of this, I became like this. Brother, more or less. Just send it here." At the edge of the thick fog, there was a passage that led directly to Enoch. At this time, at the entrance of the passage, Boss Luo stopped the reborn consciousness. The reborn consciousness didn't force it. Sending them off was just out of courtesy. There was no protection at all. It was probably a waste of time to talk about escorting in front of the 2 people in front of him. After leaving the deep pit, walk in that direction. About 5 kilometers there will be a cave. After passing through the cave, there will be a small path that leads to the surface. The location of the exit is probably at the edge of the Torito clan's farm. The reborn consciousness thought for a while and pointed out the direction, although this situation might not be necessary for the other party. It was just out of courtesy. "I see." Boss Luo nodded. "It seems that the ancient humans who escaped here must have come here through this path. Was it opened by someone?" The reborn consciousness shook his head. "No, it was formed naturally. On one hand, a lost Fang's instinct to search for food broke through the soil layer. On the other hand, some unstable changes in the inhuman territory caused the terrain to become chaotic. Oh right, there's one more thing." Luochio thought for a while and suddenly asked, "You said that before we came here, you had seen a pair of lovers. Do you still remember their names?" Although the reborn consciousness was surprised that the shop owner would be curious because of this, he didn't think much and said, "Well, they weren't killed by the vines. They died because of love. On the way out of here, in the cave in front of the exit road. If I remember correctly, they were called Norman and Beakies. After they died, their souls wandered to me, but not long after, they disappeared. After seeing the resentful spirit of the child, they killed with their own hand." "That child?" Luochio thought for a while and asked. "It's the child who brought you here." The reborn consciousness smiled, then waved his hand. From the passage, a small figure slowly flew out and sat on his shoulder. Sure enough, it was the little resentful spirit that led Boss Luo and Miss Maid to the past cave. The reborn consciousness sighed at this time and said, "They finally made a confession in front of this child, and then disappeared little by little. After that, this child was a little unstable, so I sealed its memory at that time. I didn't create past parents for it and raised it myself. I only know so much about them." Luochu smiled and said, "Don't worry, I just accidentally read the diary left by Norman before he was expelled, so I'm a little curious about what happened to them after that." "I see." The reborn consciousness nodded, then seemed to think of something and said, "After this child, they seem to have left the deep pit and lived in the cave. Not long after, they gave birth to another child." Boss Luo was thoughtful. The reborn consciousness said, "But I haven't seen this child. This child seems to be born with some kind of special ability that can block my perception." "Thank you for telling me." Boss Luo nodded gently. "Then, if there's a chance, let's talk again. A few of our companions on this trip seem to have woken up." "Take care." The reborn consciousness nodded, but just as Boss Luo and Miss Maid turned to leave, it suddenly called out, "Please wait. Please say." The reborn consciousness hesitated for a moment and finally said, "This is not a request. Remember that I once said that the former Cain encountered Shura of the Void in the crack of the dimension and finally died in this world?" Boss Luo nodded. The reborn consciousness said, "At that time, Cain had another companion with him who was also lost in this world. I think maybe you will meet in the future. At that time, I hope you can give some help. Of course, if he also needs it. If I can successfully introduce a buyer, I can waive a year's worth of property fees. Why do I have such a feeling?" Boss Luo opened his mouth slightly and then nodded. "Of course, we won't reject any customer." The reborn consciousness said, "That's good. His name is Yang Jian, and he has a strong body comparable to the pseudo-eternal indestructible body. But it seems to be different from the way Cain obtained the pseudo-eternal indestructible body. It seems to be a special training method called sanctified body. I speculate that his soul may not have dissipated like Cain. Maybe he is just in a deep sleep. Also, he should have fallen into the real world of this world, not the inhuman domain. I don't know his approximate location either. Perhaps he has already recovered and left this world." Boss Luo said with a strange expression, "The person you are talking about, does he have a third eye on his forehead?" "That's right, how can you?" The reborn consciousness was stunned, then reacted and said self-deprecatingly, "I forgot about your intelligence. Anyway, if you meet him, please take care of him. Cain and Yang Jian have been together for a long time on the road of exploration, so they have some feelings for each other." Boss Luo smiled. "Please rest assured, we will be careful in the future. After all, if he is the one I know, I think I will look forward to meeting him." People grow up to hate the water flowing east. In those years, Boss Luo, who was still a child and not a boss, was also one of the people who had been tortured. Then, goodbye, customer. Boss Luo and Miss Maid bowed to each other and then turned to leave. The reborn consciousness sighed slowly, looked at the little vengeful spirit on his shoulder, and suddenly said in a low voice, "Do you still look forward to meeting them again?" The little vengeful spirit just blinked with a confused look. The reborn consciousness smiled. The same question seemed to have no answer to it. However, at this time, they who lived in Enoch appeared one by one. In groups of 2s and 3s, they appeared behind the reborn consciousness. Some brought their children, some accompanied by lovers, some carried farm tools. A group of people, everyone. Those little vengeful spirit. No matter if it was the parents in the past that it created, or those little vengeful spirits in the real world. The reborn consciousness looked at this scene in astonishment. This was not a calculation in its mind, and it did not even ask them to appear. Outside the passage, they stood there quietly, watching Boss Luo and Miss Maid leave gradually, and finally bowed together. The reborn consciousness looked at this scene in a daze. Whether it was real or fake, it didn't seem to be important. "Let's go back." It took a deep breath. "We should have a celebration today." The passage gradually closed, and the thick fog began to gather. Finally, this place that no one could distinguish between real and fake was isolated from the world. In this way, Erlang split the Peach Mountain with an axe and then saved his mother. On the way back, Boss Luo simply told some of the story that he knew. Miss Maid was not fascinated by it, but because it was told by her master, it was naturally pleasant to hear. But Miss Maid knew about the Heavenly Palace mentioned in this story. Once, he met the owner of the Heavenly Palace, and I also saw the owner of the Heavenly Palace from afar. But I didn't expect that he had a nephew. He met with the owner of the Heavenly Palace. Boss Luo imagined what kind of scene it would be. Then, this scene seemed to be a bit strange. In your opinion, what does the owner of the Heavenly Palace look like? Boss Luo asked curiously. How should I put it? Miss Maid blinked and said, probably a guy with a long name. Puff. Boss Luo laughed out directly. That's right, the names of the gods in Taoist culture are indeed long, and there are more rare words. Oh, let's talk about this later. About 10 meters in front of him, something seemed to have started to emerge from a pile of bones. Just like a groundhog, a head directly popped out. Her head was wrapped tightly in a brown paper bag, and above it was a simple drawing of a human face with eyeliner. That's right, the one who popped her head out was Miss Witch. Boss Luo and Miss Maid looked at each other. Of course, they didn't almost forget about Maria. They walked in this direction because they knew that Maria was buried nearby. When Boss Luo and Miss Maid walked directly to Miss Witch, they saw Miss Witch struggling to climb out of the pile of bones in horror. Her body even trembled a little. At this time, when Miss Witch realized that someone was approaching her, she was startled at first, and then shrank her body. She looked up at the two women, the female boss, in front of her, and then her eyes fell on Miss Maid, saying subconsciously, You seem to be the one who came to find my sister in the morning." Miss Maid frowned and said, "You're my sister? I remember your name is Teresa." This Miss Witch quickly said her name at this time. Chapter 1354. Maria the Witch once said that due to some special reasons, she temporarily shared a body with her younger sister, Teresa. The body originally belonged to her younger sister, Teresa. "Ah, you're the mister from this morning?" When she figured out the identities of the two people in front of her, Teresa recognized Miss Maid at first, and then she recognized Boss Luo after he spoke. Her eyes were wide open as she looked around, as if she had forgotten about the terrifying place she was in. If it weren't for the mask on her face, it was an ordinary paper bag, and Maria was afraid that she would accidentally break it or lose it on the way, so in order to obtain Master Pansy's potion, she put some glue in it with tears in her eyes to stabilize it. Her face would probably be very clear. "Well, due to some special reasons," Boss Luo explained casually without any embarrassment or shyness. "If that's the case..." He glanced at Teresa and slowly asked, "Is Miss Maria asleep?" Teresa hesitated for a moment before nodding. Apart from the two people in front of her, whom she had met once, everything else was so strange. Perhaps it was because of a sense of security that she couldn't explain. "Yes, sister is sleeping soundly this time. I called her several times but she didn't respond. Did something happen to her?" "You don't know?" Luochio was quite curious. The two sisters didn't seem to share the same senses. Sure enough, Teresa shook her head. "I'm not like my sister. When she came out, I couldn't stay awake. I don't have any magic power, and I can't use any magic. I'm just an ordinary person." Boss Luo thought for a while, and Miss Maid thought for a while. Then she glanced at Teresa, and the black flame directly burned the mask. Of course, it didn't hurt her at all. She didn't even have time to react. However, Luochio remembered that Maria seemed to have broken several ribs before she drove out the vengeful spirit that invaded her body and fell into a coma. But after the body became Teresa, she didn't seem to be injured. There wasn't even the slightest bit of magic in Teresa's body. Just as she had said, she was just a normal person. It seemed that it wasn't a simple matter of one soul going in and another soul coming out, it was a sudden exchange between two people. "Miss Teresa, have you been to the inhuman domain before?" Luochu suddenly asked. She subconsciously touched her face, but she felt as if something had caressed her face, but she didn't feel anything. She nodded and said, How should I put it? Strictly speaking, my body has been here before, right? My sister said that the inhuman domain is too dangerous for ordinary people. So whenever my sister comes here, I'll usually fall asleep. Now that I think about it, my sister's words. She looked around the deep pit of corpses. The scene of white bones made her hair stand on end. She subconsciously hugged her arms. It was easy to squeeze out two spherical surfaces that were difficult to withstand. Although I occasionally hear sister talk about some anecdotes in the inhuman domain, when I see it with my own eyes, do you feel scared? Boss Luo asked softly. I do feel scared. Teresa nodded, but her expression was obviously more than that. I never knew that the inhuman domain, that my sister went to every time, would be such a dangerous place. I thought that this was a fairy tale-like world, just like the magic world in J.K.'s novels. Are you scared of the inhuman domain? Boss Luo asked again. Yes. Teresa shook her head and said frankly, maybe it's because I occasionally chat with some magicians when I'm outside. I always feel that it's not a particularly scary thing. That's good. Boss Luo smiled slightly. At this moment, a figure flew over from not far away. It was the golden dragon, who had a special hobby. From afar they could hear Fafnir, shouting beauty loudly. As for the vampire and the young girl Mina, they also heard the commotion and came over. After meeting, they naturally greeted each other. So, you don't know what happened? Busby. Norman frowned. He had a feeling that the two people in front of him were not telling the truth. He had many concerns and doubts in his heart. From the beginning, when he fell into the Lost Rift, he already knew that these guys wearing the escort team's uniform were not real vampires. The reason why he didn't expose them at the beginning was that he judged that the danger in the Lost Rift was far greater than these impersonators of the escort team. It was not wise to have a conflict with them in the Lost Rift, so he didn't say anything and chose to leave this place first. On the other hand, Busby suspected that these three impersonators might be the intruders who broke into the farm in the morning. But considering that Bailey knew about this matter and his attitude was quite subtle, he was more inclined to choose to remain silent and not expose them. Even now, the Lost Fang seemed to be strangely quiet, and he still intended to temporarily suppress these questions. Boss Luo just nodded and felt that he seemed to have a little talent in deceiving people, so he said sincerely, "We are not very familiar with this place. If possible, please explain more, Mr. Norman." Busby shook his head directly and said rather straightforwardly, "Now that the Lost Fang has quieted down, let's leave this place quickly, before it becomes active again. After leaving this deep pit, it will take another 10 minutes to reach the road to the surface. Let's go this way." As he said, he directly took the young girl Mina's arm and left. The direction was the way that Boss Luo and Miss Maid left before he regained consciousness. But Mr. Vampire probably didn't expect that after this time, the Lost Fang would never be active again. Because the Lost Fang, or to be precise, the pseudo-eternal indestructible body, was in Boss Luo's bag at this time. It's almost night, right? Luochu glanced at the time on his mobile phone at this time. He and Miss Maid went to Miss Witch's magic house at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and then entered the inhuman domain, with the help of coordinates. Now the mobile phone showed that the time was 17:49. "You missed lunch and afternoon tea," Miss Maid said. "Are you hungry?" "Not really." Luochu smiled casually, "but I still want to eat the food you cook. After reaching the surface, I will think of a way." Miss Maid chuckled. Just like that, they walked and chatted. Behind them, a pair of eyes full of resentment looked at them like this. Huang Jinlong didn't find a place to join the conversation from the beginning. The special emotional columnist of Inhuman newspaper, Miro-chan, seemed to lack practical experience in this field and was quite short of money. She silently followed behind, and several times she wanted to say something but stopped. Speaking of which, who are you? Finally, Huang Jinlong, who wanted to strike up a conversation but failed, finally noticed that there was Teresa who had been quietly removed by Miss Maid. He couldn't help but frown. Why do you have such a shameful chest? I seem to have seen it somewhere? Forget it, I'm not interested in ugly girls, you can hide aside. Teresa opened her mouth. Every time her sister entered the inhuman domain, she would have to deal with so many weird guys? It's really hard, speaking of which. I can't say that I'm ugly, right? As for the problem of the chest, it's already very troublesome. Unknowingly, this group of people had climbed up the deep pit of corpses, and then moved toward the cave that could lead to the surface, but soon after, the deep pit of corpses welcomed several figures. At first, 3 figures arrived almost at the same time. Then, another 5 figures arrived, and finally, another 4 figures arrived. A total of 12 figures gathered in the deep pit of corpses at this time. They came from the inhuman domain, the Grand Dukes of the 12 clans of the 13 clans. Except for the Grand Duke of Toreto, everyone is here? One of the 12 Grand Dukes frowned at this time. That guy still hasn't woken up after such a big thing happened? Isn't he too lazy? Another Grand Duke looked up at this time. This deep pit of corpses was under the territory of Toreto clan. In fact, these Grand Dukes could sense that the Grand Duke of Toreto was in the depths of the mountain above. At least, his aura was not wrong. He didn't attend the last Grand Duke's meeting, and only sent Baligan to attend on his behalf. The Grand Duke pondered and said, the reaction of the lost Fong was that it disappeared in the territory of the Toreto family. Did this guy do something behind our backs? What is this? At this time, another Grand Duke was looking at the thick fog in the deep pit of corpses that shouldn't be there. At this time, a few Grand Dukes circled this place that was surrounded by the thick fog at an extremely fast speed and returned. We didn't find the entrance, and we don't even seem to have a weak point. With that said, another Grand Duke waved his hand tentatively and shot out a dark red light wave. The moment the light wave shot into the thick fog, it disappeared without a trace like a clay ox entering the sea. This Grand Duke didn't believe it, and at this time, he snorted coldly and chanted an ancient language loudly. On both of his arms, dark red engravings appeared. In the end, a gigantic beam of light as thick as a meter shot out from its hands. The gigantic beam of light once again disappeared into the thick fog. At this time, the Grand Dukes couldn't help but feel shocked. The one who launched the attack had obviously made a serious move, and the attack just now was enough to destroy the land within a radius of 100 meters. At this moment, the Grand Dukes couldn't help but fall into silence. After a while, a Grand Duke broke the silence. Everyone, I believe that you all came here because you suddenly lost the connection with the holy blood that was created by the consciousness of the holy blood. This burning sensation is like a part of your consciousness being directly cut off by someone. I don't think you're mistaken. What happened? Or should I say, who did this to Lost Fong? Could it be that Toreto guy? This was its territory, and the incident had happened in its territory. Furthermore, there was this strange fog. Could there be something inside? Before I left, I heard that a few hours ago, the territory of Toreto clan was invaded by the Golden Dragon, and even their headquarters castle was destroyed into ruins, a Grand Duke suddenly said at this time. The last Golden Dragon? How is it related to that guy again? One of the Grand Dukes was impatient or easily angered, and his voice became gloomy at this moment. If they were related to the Golden Dragon, they would eventually be related to the Magician Association. As for the Magician Association, there was a first Tower Master in the Inhuman realm, and almost all of the inhuman realm didn't want to confront the first Tower Master directly. The first Tower Master was the one who built the most stable foundation of the inhuman realm, and he was invincible in the inhuman realm from the very beginning. If the first Tower Master wanted to escape, no one could find him in the inhuman realm. As for those who the first Tower Master could defeat, they would be fine. In fact, in the inhuman realm, no one had heard of anyone who could directly confront the first Tower Master of the secret technique tower. Although the Grand Dukes of the 13 clans never said it out loud, they all knew that in front of the first Tower Master, even though the Grand Dukes of the 13 clans could stand at the top of the inhuman domain, they were still just a little brother. Otherwise, with the countless years of grudges between the 13 clans and the werewolves, the two clans wouldn't have been able to live peacefully in the inhuman domain for hundreds of years. In the war 100 years ago, the two races even formed a team for the first time. All of this was facilitated by the first Tower Master. At this moment, the 12 Grand Dukes who rushed here as soon as they sensed that something was wrong felt like disaster had fallen from the sky while they were sitting at home. Perhaps we should find the guy who's absent and ask him about it. A Grand Duke who was calm said slowly, "We can't let all of our efforts go to waste. Then the sacred blood ceremony has been going on for such a long time, and that consciousness can already control the lost Fong." "That's right." Another Grand Duke gritted his teeth. "No matter what, we can't give up on the lost Fong. This is our only chance to take revenge on that abominable nightmare-eating tapir. I'll never forget the humiliation that Erex brought to me." With that, the Grand Duke rushed into the sky. This was the territory of the Teredo clan, and the most direct way to the place where Grand Duke Teredo was sleeping was to break into the mountain. Perhaps because of their anger, these Grand Dukes didn't care too much about the etiquette of the 13 ancient families. It didn't take long for the hard rocks to be broken under the claws of the furious Grand Dukes like mud brick. Soon, the 12 Grand Dukes broke out an entrance and entered an ancient cave. In the cave, a huge bronze coffin was hanging in the center of the ancient cave with 12 chains. The 12 Grand Dukes broke into this place like a group of boorish men breaking into a young girl's boudoir, but the girl in the boudoir still didn't respond. They couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, so they opened the huge bronze coffin hanging above. The moment the huge bronze coffin opened, what appeared in front of the 12 Grand Dukes was a very simple scarecrow. On the scarecrow, there was a piece of white paper with the word Grand Duke written on it. The handwriting is quite good." "No, what's going on?"